The most frightening part of a town-wide channel called Your Bedroom is not that it sounds impossible. It is that old television systems were never as private as they felt. They were built around shared pathways, central equipment, trusted overrides, relay points, local channels, and signals that could replace what a household thought it had chosen. A television in a bedroom looked like a personal object. A channel lineup was not personal at all. It was distribution. It was hierarchy. It was a chain. So the first question in this archive is not whether every set in town became haunted. The first question is, which legitimate pathway would have to be corrupted first? The accounts gathered afterward agree on the phrase, even when they disagree on almost everything else. Your bedroom. Not a warning. Not a station call sign. Not a test pattern. Not the name of a school board feed or a city council replay. Just those two words, placed where a channel identifier would normally sit, as if the system itself had assigned a label to the most private room in the house. Some viewers said they found it while turning the dial before work. Some said their sets changed without being touched. Some described the image as dim, fixed, and domestic. A bed, a door, a lamp, sometimes no movement at all. Others remembered only the title card, white letters against a dark background, followed by a low sound that might have been tape noise, air conditioning, or ordinary analog hiss. The archive does not treat these statements as proof of a single impossible event. It treats them as witness material from a fictional case built around real vulnerabilities in older television systems. That distinction matters. The horror here is not improved by pretending that television could magically see into every home. It becomes worse when we ask how much of the delivery system already existed. A town-wide television event would not need every television to fail separately. The more plausible shape is centralized. A feed enters a cable headend. A local origination channel is switched. A public, educational, or governmental slot carries unexpected material. An emergency override interrupts normal programming. A relay path is compromised. A broadcast signal is displaced before it reaches viewers. The home screen is the last surface, not the first cause. That is the contradiction at the center of the file. A bedroom is singular. A television channel is collective. One belongs to a person. The other belongs to a system designed to send the same thing everywhere. American viewers have seen ordinary programming replaced before. On November 22, 1987, unauthorized video interrupted two Chicago television stations, WGN-TV and WTTW. Contemporary reporting from UPI described a video pirate striking two stations and replacing regular programming with skits featuring a figure resembling Max Headroom. WTTW later identified the second interruption as occurring during a broadcast of Doctor Who. The people responsible were not publicly identified. That incident does not prove that a channel called Your Bedroom occurred. It proves something narrower and more useful for this archive. Viewers once sat in ordinary rooms, watching familiar television, and saw the expected signal abruptly replaced by unauthorized material. The screen did not announce in advance that it had become insecure. It simply changed. There is another reason to begin with mechanisms rather than ghosts. Television already includes legitimate interruption paths. The Emergency Alert System is a national public warning system that can interrupt radio and television programming. FEMA states that participants include radio and TV broadcasters, cable TV, wireless cable systems, satellite operators, and wireline operators. The purpose is public safety. The design assumption is that some messages must outrank entertainment, routine, and private preference. That is not sinister by itself. It is necessary. But horror often begins where a trusted function is imagined in the wrong hands. A forced interruption feels different from a viewer changing channels. It carries authority. It says, "Stop watching what you chose and watch this instead." The name Your Bedroom has that same forced quality. It does not invite. It assigns. In a normal cable system, the most believable place to look would be the headend. A cable headend is the local or regional facility where incoming television feeds can be received, processed, modulated, and redistributed to subscribers. That sentence is technical, but its emotional meaning is simple. A town may experience television as thousands of separate living rooms, kitchens, basements, and bedrooms. The system may experience it as one distribution problem. Incoming satellite programming, off-air broadcasts, local origination, public access material, municipal feeds, and other sources can be collected and sent onward. If a wrong signal enters that kind of point, it does not need to persuade each household. It only needs to be placed where the system expects a channel to be. This is why the title is more disturbing than a pirate face or a threatening message. A pirate face announces intrusion. Your bedroom suggests classification. It sounds like a channel label generated by an ordinary control room, a local slot that has always been there but was never meant to be noticed. Public, educational, and governmental channels deepen that unease. United States law allows cable franchising authorities to require channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use under 47 U.S.C. Section 531. These are often called peg channels. In many towns, they are mundane by design: community notices, school events, public meetings, bulletin boards, local programming. Their ordinariness is their disguise. A strange image appearing there would not need to break the whole system. It could wear the shape of local administration. And yet, the phrase "your bedroom" does not belong to any city office. It does not belong on a municipal bulletin board. It is too intimate for a public access slot and too calm for an emergency alert. It is not a station identity. It is a boundary violation written in the language of channel navigation. There are other possible routes. A broadcast relay could be targeted. A satellite-distributed signal could be interrupted upstream. The Captain Midnight incident on April 27, 1986, showed that an unauthorized message could interrupt HBO's satellite-distributed signal during a film broadcast. Historical accounts associate that case with HBO, the satellite Galaxy 1, and John R. MacDougall, who was identified in the reporting and legal aftermath. Again, the lesson is limited but important. A single upstream point can matter to many downstream viewers. The law recognizes the danger of interference. Federal law in 47 U.S.C. Section 333 prohibits willful or malicious interference with radio communications of stations licensed or authorized under United States communications law. FCC Part 15 rules also place conditions on unlicensed radio frequency devices, requiring that they not cause harmful interference and that they accept interference from authorized stations and other radiators. These rules do not make the fictional case real. They show that the environment around radio frequency devices has always required boundaries, permissions, and tolerances most viewers never see. Inside the home, that invisibility becomes intimate. A television set sits near the bed. A cable line enters through a wall. A VCR, converter box, antenna, or RF modulator turns signal into habit. Most households do not think of these as part of a regulated communications environment. They think of them as furniture. That is why this archive keeps returning to the bedroom. Not because the room is technically special, but because it is emotionally final. Public systems are supposed to stop at the wall. Broadcast towers, cable franchises, emergency alert chains, satellite uplinks, headends, relay links, and local channels may fill the air or the wire, but the viewer is allowed to believe that the last few feet belong to them. The channel name denies that belief. It says the shared system knows the private room. At this stage of the report, there is no need to choose one pathway. Choosing too early would make the case smaller. The point is to understand the field of possibility that analog-era television created: centralized distribution, continuous signals, privileged interruptions, local channel slots, and a domestic receiver that did not ask many questions about what arrived. Before the full-power analog broadcast transition ended in the United States on June 12, 2009, television still carried the memory of dials, snow, ghosting, channel drift, and signals that felt less like selected files than weather entering the house. That is the soil this nightmare grows from. Not a haunted object on a dresser. A receiver. A system. A town full of screens waiting for whichever signal the chain delivered next. If the first chapter ends with a town full of screens waiting, then the second question is what kind of waiting analog television actually performed. It was not waiting in the way a modern menu waits. It was not holding a list of files, thumbnails, recommendations, and accounts. It was not asking a server what the household was permitted to see. In the American analog era, The television receiver was tuned to a channel and then exposed to a continuous electrical description of an image and its sound. The set did not possess the program as an object. It did not download the scene, verify its title, and place it neatly into a library. It followed a signal as it arrived. That distinction is where the old fear begins. In the NTSC-era system used in the United States, analog television built its picture through a scanning structure of 525 lines, with each frame transmitted in about 1/30th of a second, according to technical summaries of the system, such as Britannica's overview. The household viewer did not need to know that. Most people did not sit in front of the set imagining lines, frames, synchronization, modulation, and carrier waves. They saw a face, a baseball game, a weather map, a late movie, a school board meeting, a test pattern, a commercial for a local furniture store. But underneath the familiar image was a process. Line after line, field after field, frame after frame, the screen being refreshed by information arriving from outside the room. The analog picture was therefore not an item chosen once and then possessed. It was a performance that had to keep happening. If the right signal remained present, the image held. If the signal weakened, snow entered. If a reflected path arrived slightly late, a ghost appeared beside the real picture. If tuning drifted, the program seemed to loosen at the edges. The face stretched, rolled, tore, buzzed, or dissolved. These were ordinary technical failures, but in memory, they behave almost like omens. The set revealed that its confidence was conditional. This matters to a channel called Your Bedroom, because the premise depends on a screen that feels receptive before it feels selective. A modern viewer is trained to think in terms of choice. Open an app, select a title, resume playback, close the app. The path may be complicated behind the glass, but the ritual is organized around the viewer's decision. Analog television had a different domestic ritual. You turned the set on. You selected a channel. Then you accepted whatever was being carried there. Sometimes that meant the national network. Sometimes the local station. Sometimes a cable channel. Sometimes a public access slot. Sometimes a blank municipal bulletin board with block letters and background music. Sometimes nothing stable at all. The crucial point is that the receiver's loyalty was not to the viewer's expectation. It was to the signal occupying the tuned path. That is why analog horror so often returns to the old screen. Not because analog technology was magical, and not because every fear about it was technically accurate. The power comes from the way the system made invisible hierarchy visible. The viewer might feel alone in a bedroom, but the image belonged to a chain. Somewhere outside the house, a station, cable system, relay, satellite feed, or local source had priority. Somewhere, equipment decided what occupied the channel. Somewhere, an interruption could outrank the program. In the fictional town archive, this is the first plausible pressure point. Residents would describe their sets as if each one had betrayed them separately. One person would say the bedroom television switched by itself. Another would say the living room console lost the late news. Someone else would remember hearing a pop, or a hum, or the soft click of a cable box changing state. But the more technically grounded interpretation is colder. The sets may not have acted individually at all. They may have done exactly what they were built to do. They may have followed the strongest, closest, or most privileged signal delivered to them. Analog television made that idea emotionally legible. Snow was not just absence, it was the visible form of weak reception. Ghosting was not just distortion, it was evidence that the signal had traveled more than one path. Interference was not abstract, it bent the picture in front of you. The viewer could watch the system struggle. The home became the final surface of a public infrastructure. This is different from saying the infrastructure could literally see into bedrooms. The report does not need that claim, and the evidence does not support it. The horror lies in the collision between two categories that television normally kept separate. The bedroom was private, intimate, unbroadcast. The channel was public, shared, distributed. When a channel label says, "Your bedroom," it creates a contradiction before any picture appears. It says a mass medium has named the one place it should not know. The analog era gives that contradiction texture. A cathode ray tube in a dark room had a physical presence modern screens often lack in memory. It warmed. It whined faintly. It bloomed from black into gray, then into an image. Static had depth. A bad signal looked like weather. A vertical hold problem made the picture climb away from itself. The machine seemed to be receiving the world through a fragile opening, not merely displaying a selected product. So when the wrong image arrived, the wrongness did not feel like a software error. It felt like something had entered. There is a reason the full-power analog broadcast transition date in the United States, June 12th, 2009, feels like more than a regulatory milestone in stories like this. It marks the end of a familiar public texture for full-power broadcast television, the ordinary household expectation that a station could fade, roll, ghost, or dissolve into snow. Cable and other systems complicate the timeline, and analog habits did not vanish from every living room on the same day. But as a cultural marker, that date helps locate the nightmare. The strongest version belongs to a time when viewers still understood a television set as a receiver in the older sense. A receiver accepts. That is the beautiful and frightening word. It accepts authorized broadcasts. It accepts local channels. It accepts cable-modulated signals. It accepts emergency interruptions when the system is built to pass them. It accepts interference when the conditions allow interference to reach it. Under Federal Communications Commission Part 15 rules, unlicensed radio frequency devices operate on the condition that they do not cause harmful interference and that they accept interference from authorized stations and other radiators. That rule belongs to a specific regulatory category, not to folklore. But as atmosphere, it captures a broader truth of the household electronics world. Many devices radiated, received, leaked, or reacted in ways most owners could not directly perceive. The room was never sealed from the spectrum around it. That does not mean the television was an eye. It means the television was part of an electromagnetic environment, and ordinary people were asked to trust layers of technical order they could not see. The screen showed confidence, but the confidence came from synchronization, signal strength, modulation, equipment alignment, and distribution priority. When those layers failed or were misused, the failure appeared in the most personal place possible, the room where the viewer sat. The privacy anxiety around screens had other real technical shadows as well. In 1985, Wim van Eck published Electromagnetic Radiation from Video Display Units, an Eavesdropping Risk, in Computers and Security, describing research showing that information displayed on video display units could be reconstructed from electromagnetic emissions. That research should be handled carefully. It is not evidence that an ordinary television broadcast system could simply look into a bedroom. It is not proof of the fictional channel, but it belongs to the same period mood, the unsettling recognition that screens and electronic devices might reveal more than their owners intended, and that invisible emissions could carry traces of private information beyond the boundaries of the machine. Analog nightmares feed on that recognition. They do not require every viewer to understand the physics. They require only a household sense that the set is open to outside forces and that experts somewhere know routes through the air and wire that ordinary families do not. So when the archive describes a town where every television displays a channel called Your Bedroom, the analog question is not, how did each set choose this? The better question is, where in the chain did this become the thing being sent? That is the disciplined path through the fear. Not a possessed dial. Not 1,000 separate hauntings. A continuous signal accepted by receivers. A shared channel occupying a distribution route. A private phrase given public carriage. Once that is understood, the town begins to rearrange itself. The houses are no longer the center of the map. The televisions are no longer isolated objects on dressers and carts. The important location moves outward, away from the bedrooms, toward the place where signals gather before they are sent back into the town. Somewhere there is a room most subscribers never enter, with racks of equipment, incoming feeds, modulators, monitors, and cables labeled for channels the public experiences only as numbers on a dial. If the nightmare has a throat, it is not the speaker in the television cabinet. It is the point where the town's channels are swallowed, processed, and spoken again. The throat of the system was usually not dramatic from the outside. That is part of why it works so well as the center of this file. A cable headend could sit in a plain utility building, behind a fence, in a low commercial structure, or in a room most residents would pass without recognizing. To the subscriber, television seemed to begin at the set. To the operator, it began much earlier, at the place where signals were gathered, shaped, assigned, and sent back out through the cable plant. In the language of cable systems, a headend is a local or regional facility where incoming television feeds can be received, processed, modulated, and redistributed to subscribers. That sentence is technical, but it contains the shape of the nightmare. Received, processed, modulated, redistributed. Each word is ordinary. Each word also means that the picture in a bedroom may have passed through a point of control outside the bedroom before it ever reached the screen. The fictional record becomes more believable when it stops imagining every television in town as an independent victim. 1,000 sets do not need to make the same mistake at the same time. 1,000 families do not need to tune themselves, by chance, to the same forbidden source. If the wrong image enters the right distribution point, the town can experience it as a single event. The private room does not have to be individually invaded. The channel lineup has to be altered, interrupted, or supplied with something it should not carry. That is why the headend matters. Historically, cable headends served as aggregation points. They could collect satellite programming, off-air broadcast signals, local origination material, public access content, and other feeds. Those sources did not all begin in the same place. Some arrived from the sky. Some came from local antennas. Some came from equipment inside the cable operation itself. Some came from community or institutional sources that had been given channel capacity. At the head end, those different streams could be converted into the channel plan that subscribers experienced as a familiar row of numbers. The viewer did not usually see that process. The viewer saw a remote control, a dial, a coaxial cable screwed into the back of a set or converter, and a channel label in the newspaper or on a printed guide. The system behind it disappeared into habit. Channel 3 was whatever Channel 3 had always been. Channel 6 was the local station. A high number might be weather, school notices, a city bulletin board, or a public access studio with fluorescent lights and bad audio. The map felt domestic because it was repeated every day inside the home. But the map was not made inside the home. The head end was where the town's television geography could be arranged. It was where one source could be placed onto one channel position and another source onto another. It was where an incoming signal could be received and given form suitable for the local cable system. In an analog context, that word, modulated, matters. A feed was not just a program in an abstract sense. It had to be carried as a signal in a form that televisions and cable equipment could accept. The channel did not simply exist as an idea called news, sports, or public access. It was placed onto a technical path. For the archive report, this gives investigators a colder question than, who was watching whom? The question becomes, where did the feed enter the chain? If every affected household saw the same thing at the same time, under the same channel name, then the bedroom television becomes less like evidence of an individual haunting and more like the last visible terminal of a shared distribution route. The event has to be traced upstream. That upstream search changes the emotional scale. In a haunted house story, the bedroom is the most intimate room. In a cable system story, the bedroom is only an endpoint. The more important room may be windowless, equipment-filled, and unvisited by the people whose nights it controls. It may contain racks, monitors, signal processors, modulators, and patching arrangements that make private viewing depend on public infrastructure. The horror is not that a single screen misbehaved. The horror is that the town had always been listening to a centralized voice and calling it choice. This does not require claiming that a real town-wide channel called Your Bedroom ever existed. The structure is enough. The fictional file gains its pressure from the fact that older television systems already included choke points where many homes could be affected by one upstream condition. A corrupted feed at the wrong place would not need to knock on each door. It would move along routes built for ordinary service. There is a temptation in telling this kind of story to make the head end feel like a villain's lair. But the more faithful image is quieter. It is maintenance logs, labels, signal levels, the controlled clutter of a working communications room, a place designed not to be mysterious, but reliable. Its purpose is to prevent the town from noticing it. When it functions correctly, it disappears. When something impossible appears on every screen, That invisibility becomes suspicious. Subscribers tend to remember the television as an object. The weight of the cathode ray tube, the static on the glass, the warmth rising from the cabinet, the knob, the remote, the converter box. They remember where the set stood in the bedroom, what was on top of it, which wall it faced. These memories make the device feel personal, but cable distribution makes the personal object part of a municipal body. The coaxial line behind the dresser leads outward, joining other lines, then larger routes, then the equipment that determines what the set can receive. In that sense, the title, Your Bedroom, becomes an accusation against the viewer's assumptions. It says, "You thought this room was the beginning of the signal." It was not. You thought the screen belonged to the room because it was inside the room. It did not. You thought a channel was something you selected. But a channel is also something assigned, carried, and delivered. That distinction is where the fear settles. The headend also explains why the event would feel coordinated without feeling supernatural. If the same channel label or feed appears throughout the town, witnesses might describe it as if the televisions acted together. In ordinary speech, they would say, "Every television switched." But technically, another description may be more plausible. The system supplied the same unexpected program to the channel positions those televisions were already able to receive. The screens did not conspire. They obeyed. Obedience is central to analog nightmares. A receiver does not morally evaluate a signal. It does not ask whether the name of the channel is appropriate, whether the image is private, or whether the source is authorized in the human sense. It responds to what arrives in a usable form. At the town scale, the cable system can behave the same way. Equipment is built to pass, convert, and distribute. Trust is embedded in the path. If a source is present at a privileged point, downstream devices may treat it as television. That is why a headend is more frightening than a single pirate transmitter in this chapter's version of the file. A lone, unauthorized signal might affect some receivers under the right conditions, but it has to compete with distance, strength, tuning, and geography. A feed introduced at a distribution point enters after many of those battles have already been decided. It does not need to overpower the town from outside if it can become one of the town's own channels from within the system. Again, the record should stay careful. The known history of television intrusion includes real events, and later chapters will return to them by name. Chicago, Illinois, on November 22, 1987. WGN-TV and WTTW, the unresolved Max Headroom interruption, and the satellite wound of Captain Midnight on April 27, 1986. Those incidents matter because they show that television distribution could be interrupted in ways that ordinary viewers experience suddenly and collectively. But the headend chapter is not claiming those cases were headend events. It is explaining why, for a fictional town-wide channel, the local cable distribution point is one of the most credible places to begin looking. The headend gives investigators a physical scene to imagine after the calls begin. Not a spirit in the walls. Not an eye hidden behind every screen. A facility with inputs. A lineup. A place where an ordinary channel could carry an extraordinary message. If households reported that the channel called Your Bedroom appeared where a familiar local service normally lived, the question would not only be what was shown. It would be what that channel position was supposed to be, what equipment fed it, and who or what had access to the path. And this is where the throat connects to the mask. A town's cable system does not carry only national entertainment and broadcast stations. It can also carry local channels that many viewers barely notice until something strange happens on them. Municipal announcements, school board meetings, community programming, public, educational, and governmental capacity, low-budget feeds with plain titles and bureaucratic purposes. These are the perfect hiding places because they already belong to the local system. They do not have to look like an attack at first. They can look like a neglected channel waking up. So the headend gives the nightmare its anatomy. The local channel gives it clothing. The phrase, "your bedroom," does not need to arrive as a flaming pirate emblem or a masked face breaking into a famous broadcast. It could appear in the quietest part of the lineup, under the kind of civic label people skip every night until the label changes, the audio drops, and the town realizes that the most ignored channel on the dial has been given something intimate to say. That quiet local slot is where the disguise begins to matter. A town-wide nightmare does not have to enter the lineup as a spectacular violation. It does not have to seize a famous network, interrupt a championship game, or replace a beloved station ident with a masked figure. Those are the events people remember immediately because they are obvious breaks in the order of things. But a channel called Your Bedroom becomes more disturbing if, at first, it does not look like a break at all. It looks like administration. It looks like municipal space. It looks like one of the channels that had always been there, carrying school lunch notices, council meetings, zoning board agendas, church basement concerts, or a bulletin board with white text on a blue background. That ordinary mask has a legal and institutional history. In the United States, federal law allows cable franchising authorities to require channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. The citation is 47 U.S.C. Section 531, and the phrase is usually shortened in the industry and in local practice to PEG, public, educational, and governmental. It is one of those abbreviations that sounds harmless because it is. It describes civic access, a way for local systems to reserve space for local speech, school content, public meetings, and official information. It belongs to the same world as franchise agreements, city councils, cable offices, community producers, and government notices. In the archive file, that is exactly why it is frightening. A pirate channel has to explain itself. It has to overcome the viewer's sense that something impossible has happened. But a PEG channel begins with permission. Not permission for horror, not permission for surveillance, not permission for the violation imagined in this case, but permission for a channel to exist as part of the local cable system. It is already supposed to be local. It is already supposed to look modest. It is already allowed to be boring. The phrase, your bedroom, placed there, would not first resemble a technical attack. It would resemble a bad label. A resident turning through the lineup might pass the usual local government channel and see a title card that appears misentered. Your bedroom. The font might be plain. The audio might be silent. There may be no announcer, no declaration, no theatrical arrival. For a few seconds, the viewer can protect themselves with normal explanations. A placeholder. A joke by a staff member. A student project on the school access channel. A community programming mistake. A cable guide error. A test feed waiting for a meeting to begin. The horror enters through delay. The channel has time to be mundane before it becomes impossible. Local origination makes that delay plausible. Cable systems have long had the ability to include material that did not come from a national broadcaster or distant satellite feed. A local origination channel could carry programming made for that system, inserted into the lineup at the local level. It could be simple, improvised, underfunded, and deeply familiar to the people who ignored it. In practical terms, it belongs near the same world as the headend described earlier. Incoming signals, local sources, modulators, monitors, and the act of assigning a feed to a channel that subscribers experience only as a number. That means the channel called Your Bedroom does not need to fight every television individually. It only needs to become the thing the system is already distributing in that slot. The disguise is not invisibility. The disguise is ordinariness. There is a special kind of vulnerability in channels nobody watches closely. The famous channels have viewers, advertisers, station staff, ratings, expectations. When they fail, people call. When they are interrupted, someone notices quickly. But a local access channel can sit for hours with a fixed graphic, a scrolling list of community events, or a camera pointed at an empty council chamber before anyone treats stillness as suspicious. Its low production value becomes camouflage. A bad microphone, a dark room, washed-out video, a calendar graphic that lags behind the month, none of these conditions automatically signal danger. They are part of the texture. That texture matters to analog horror because it lets the impossible arrive wearing the clothes of civic routine. Picture the archive entry not as a red alert, but as a series of ordinary complaints. At first, residents do not say the whole town has been invaded. They say the public access channel is acting strange. They say the school channel has a new name. They say the local channel is showing a dark interior, maybe a bedpost, maybe a door, maybe nothing identifiable. They disagree about the channel number because cable lineups vary by package, neighborhood, or memory. Some call it the government channel. Some call it the school channel. Some say it used to show board meetings. Others remember only that it was the channel they skipped on the way to something else. This confusion is useful to the event. It keeps it below the level of a single clean alarm. Nobody begins with the word intrusion if the channel already belonged to the local system. Nobody begins with the word surveillance if the image is too dim to interpret. Nobody begins with the word bedroom if they are still hoping the title card is a mistake. The law does not create the nightmare. 47 U.S.C. Section 531 is not a horror mechanism. It is a public policy mechanism, a way for local franchising authorities to require cable channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. But horror often forms in the gap between what a system is built to do and what a frightened viewer imagines it could be made to do. The system is built to reserve local space. The nightmare asks what happens if that local space speaks with the wrong intimacy. Public access, in its benign form, carries the promise that ordinary people and local institutions can appear on television without needing a national platform. Educational channels can carry school content. Governmental channels can carry official meetings or public information. The signal is not glamorous. It is close. That closeness is the point. And closeness is exactly what the phrase "your bedroom" abuses. The title does not say "the bedroom." It does not say "a bedroom." It says "your bedroom." It turns the local channel's proximity into accusation. The possessive word makes the channel feel as if it has crossed out of municipal space and entered the house. But technically, in the fiction, the movement is still outward from the system to the viewers. The screen has not necessarily become a camera. The channel has become a claim. It tells each household that the image belongs to them before the image has proven anything. That is one reason the premise works better as an archive report than as a solved case. The evidence would be messy. Some viewers would insist they saw their own room. Some would admit, later, that they only saw a room like theirs. Some would have turned the set off before the feed changed. Some would have tuned in after the title card had already vanished. The archive would contain phone logs, operator notes, perhaps references to a local channel, perhaps no reliable recording at all. The more ordinary the channel's official purpose, the harder it becomes to separate technical malfunction from deliberate presentation in the first minutes. The bureaucratic mask also changes the emotional temperature of the event. A spectacular hijacking invites panic. A local access anomaly invites attention. It asks people to lean in. It lets them become investigators before they realize they are witnesses. It lets the town gather around the same neglected frequency, not because a national voice commanded them, but because rumor travels faster than certainty. Someone calls a neighbor. Someone says to check the municipal channel. Someone says the title changed again. Someone says, quietly, that the room on screen has the same wallpaper as the upstairs rental on Maple, or the same lamp as the house across from the elementary school. The danger is not that every claim is true. The danger is that the system can distribute the question to everyone at once. This is where PEG capacity becomes more than a legal footnote in the story. It gives the event a place to hide that is already sanctioned, already local, already expected to be uneven. It does not explain how the forbidden image entered the chain. That belongs to the larger set of possibilities surrounding headends, local feeds, relay paths, and later, emergency interruption systems. But it explains why the first sight of your bedroom might not produce the immediate reaction a viewer imagines. It may not look like an enemy breaking down the door. It may look like a city office left unlocked after hours. And in analog-era memory, that is a powerful image, a channel with no polished identity, no corporate shield, no glossy schedule, just a local slot humming in the dark. The screen glows. The title is too personal. The picture beneath it is hard to read. The viewer waits for a correction, a test pattern, a staff apology, any sign that the system knows the difference between community access and private space. But the system's most trusted interruptions do not rely on quiet disguise. They rely on authority. They arrive with tones, crawls, and a learned obedience in the viewer's body. If the local channel is the perfect mask because people ignore it, the emergency path is more frightening for the opposite reason. People are trained to stop ignoring everything else. That trained attention is the key difference between a strange local channel and an emergency interruption. A public access slot can be missed. A municipal bulletin board can glow unnoticed in the upper reaches of the lineup for years, but an alert is designed to cut across habit. It is meant to step in front of entertainment, sports, late movies, morning news, children's programming, and the private rhythm of a household. It does not ask the viewer to browse toward it. It arrives. That is why the emergency alert system belongs in this file, not as a claim that the fictional Your Bedroom incident occurred through it, but as one of the most important real mechanisms for understanding how television can be made to stop being television. The emergency alert system is a national public warning system. In ordinary language, that means it is built for moments when information is supposed to outrank the program already in progress. FEMA describes it as a system that can interrupt radio and television programming, including broadcast, cable, satellite, and wireline video services. Those categories matter because they widen the corridor. The alert path is not just a local broadcast tower speaking to antennas. It reaches into the different ways American homes have received scheduled video, over the air, through cable systems, through satellite operators, and through wireline video services. In a safety context, this is the point. A warning that cannot interrupt is only another program. A warning that waits politely for a commercial break may arrive too late. The design philosophy is simple and public-minded. If a message is urgent enough, the system must be able to override ordinary programming and make itself visible or audible to the people who need it. That is the benevolent version of forced attention. It is also the reason the mechanism carries such weight and horror. The fictional channel name, Your Bedroom, is frightening because it violates scale. Television is public distribution. A bedroom is private space. The emergency alert system introduces a different violation, one based not on privacy, but on hierarchy. It teaches viewers that some signals are more important than consent. You may have chosen the channel. You may have paid for the service. You may have lowered the volume, left the room, or fallen asleep in front of the set. But the alert is not part of your chosen program. It is a message from outside the evening's normal structure, and the entire habit of television has trained the audience to accept that this can happen. That training is not irrational. It is civic conditioning, and in real emergencies, it can save lives. The danger in the fictional archive is not that viewers are foolish for trusting the path. The danger is that the path works because it is trusted. FEMA states that emergency alert system participants include radio and television broadcasters, cable television systems, wireless cable systems, satellite operators, and wireline operators. Read as a list in a public document. Those are administrative categories. Read inside the analog nightmare. They become rooms in the same building. A broadcaster may carry the alert. A cable system may carry the alert. A satellite operator may carry the alert. A wireline operator may carry the alert. The viewer at home does not usually see the distinction. The viewer sees the interruption. That collapse of complexity into one domestic event is essential. A person sitting in a dark bedroom does not experience participating communications providers across multiple distribution platforms. They experience the show stopping. They experience the sound changing. They experience text moving across the image or replacing it. They experience the old authority of television, speaking in a voice that is not a host, not an actor, not a local commercial, not a station promo. It is the voice of the system. This is where the title, Your Bedroom, becomes most poisonous as an imagined alert. On an ordinary channel, the phrase might look like a prank, a local access mistake, a damaged character generator, or a piece of late-night programming with a bad sense of humor. But if it appears after emergency tones, or inside a forced interruption, or under the visual grammar associated with public warning, the viewer's first instinct may not be skepticism. The first instinct may be obedience. Sit up. Read. Listen. Do not change the channel yet. Something important is happening. The channel called Your Bedroom does not need to convince everyone forever. It only needs a few seconds of borrowed authority. It needs that pause before the viewer decides whether the message is real. It needs the household to go quiet in the way households go quiet when regular programming is interrupted. That silence is part of the infrastructure too. Not wires, not towers, not head-end racks, but a learned social reflex. When the alert tone comes, people stop talking. The archive report has to be careful here. The real emergency alert system is not a horror device. It is a public warning system, and the reason it can interrupt programming is the same reason it exists. The system is supposed to carry urgent warnings through familiar media when people may not be looking anywhere else. In that sense, its authority is earned by purpose. But analog horror often lives in the gap between purpose and effect. It asks what happens when a mechanism built for reassurance becomes indistinguishable for one night from a mechanism of intrusion. The older television environment makes that question sharper. Viewers of analog-era broadcasting and cable already understood that the set could be interrupted by forces above the program. The picture could roll, tear, fade, fill with snow, or cut to a test. Local channels could appear crude. A cable lineup could include community bulletin boards and municipal feeds. A headend could gather many sources and send them back out as if they had always belonged together. The emergency alert system adds something more formal to that landscape, an authorized path whose whole reason for being is to supersede the normal schedule. In the fictional town, this would change how witnesses remembered the first moments. If your bedroom appeared as an unexplained channel in the lineup, people might say they found it. They might say they stumbled onto it while changing channels. But if it arrived through an emergency-style interruption, they would say it came over everything. They would remember what they had been watching only because it was taken away. A sitcom froze. A newscast vanished. A movie cut off mid-sentence. A late-night infomercial dissolved into a crawl. The important fact would not be which program was interrupted. The important fact would be that interruption itself felt official before it felt wrong. That official feeling is the horror of the chapter. Not gore, not spectacle, not a masked intruder yet, but procedure. The kind of procedure that enters the living room with the clean confidence of a public utility. There is no need for a villain to shout. The structure has already taught the audience where to place their attention. And because the system spans more than one kind of service, the imagined report becomes harder for residents to dismiss as a single bad television. A person on broadcast sees an interruption. A person on cable reports the same title. Someone receiving satellite service describes the same forced break, or believes they did. In a real investigation, those differences would matter enormously. Each platform has its own technical path, its own operators, its own points of control and failure. But in the first hour of public fear, platform distinctions blur. The town does not say, multiple video distribution services appear to have been affected. The town says it was on every television. That phrase, as imprecise as it is, carries the emotional truth of mass media. Television becomes most powerful when it makes separate rooms feel synchronized. Families in different neighborhoods, strangers in different apartments, elderly residents asleep in recliners, children watching from the floor, all receiving the same imposed message. The private room remains physically private, but the screen makes it part of a shared event. If the message says your bedroom, the town is forced into a contradiction. Everyone is seeing something addressed to the most intimate place in the house. The trusted emergency path intensifies that contradiction because it does not feel like a channel among channels. It feels like the reason channels can be interrupted at all. Its legitimacy comes from the expectation that there are moments when the public must be warned, and that warning must be allowed to override entertainment. In the horror version, the same expectation becomes the opening. Not because the real system is inherently sinister, but because trust is always a route. A door marked emergency exit is still a door. A circuit reserved for public safety is still a circuit. A message designed to outrank the schedule still has to travel through equipment, operators, monitoring relationships, and distribution paths. That is where the file begins to narrow from authority to transmission. The emergency alert system is not only a symbol on the screen or a tone in the room. It is a networked practice among participants, a way for warnings to move across institutions that the viewer never sees. FEMA describes emergency alert system monitoring as a daisy chain arrangement, with station equipment monitoring other stations for alerts independent of the internet. That detail shifts the fear again. The question is no longer only what happens when people trust an interruption. It is what happens when the interruption itself is trusted by the next machine in line. The next machine in line is where the imagined case becomes colder. A viewer at home experiences an interruption as a single event. The picture changes. The sound changes. A crawl appears. A warning tone cuts through the room. It feels as if one authority has spoken directly into the house. But behind that moment is a chain of listening devices, station practices, and distribution relationships. FEMA's description of emergency alert system monitoring uses the language of a daisy chain. Station equipment monitors other stations for alerts, and that monitoring can function independent of the internet. That last phrase matters. Independent of the internet does not mean magical, primitive, or unsafe by itself. It means the warning architecture was built around broadcast and communications paths that do not require a browser, a social platform, or a web server to carry the message. In public safety terms, that is a strength. When ordinary networks are congested, damaged, or unavailable, emergency information still needs a way to move. A warning system cannot be designed only for calm afternoons and good connectivity. It has to imagine storms, outages, fires, attacks, and confusion. But horror often begins with a public virtue viewed from the wrong angle. A daisy chain is a structure of trust. One participant monitors another. One piece of equipment waits for a signal that has been given priority over normal programming. One station's alert can become the alert another station receives, validates according to its configuration, and passes along. The viewer never sees that chain. The viewer sees the final result, regular television yielding to something that claims urgency. In the fictional town file, this is the reason the phrase, "your bedroom," does not have to arrive as a powerful transmitter, shouting over every antenna at once. The more plausible nightmare is quieter. It imagines a message entering a trusted path and then being repeated because the path is designed for repetition, not because every person believes it, not because every operator understands it, not because every living room has been individually targeted. The fear is that the system's own habit of listening becomes the vehicle. This episode is not claiming that such an event happened. It is not claiming that FEMA's emergency alert system was used to make a town watch a channel called Your Bedroom. The point is narrower and, in some ways, more disturbing. The documented architecture gives the fiction a believable grammar. It shows how public warning systems are not only loud messages, but relationships among institutions. Broadcasters, cable systems, satellite operators, wireline video services, and other participants exist inside a larger warning environment. The alert is not simply a graphic. It is a routed command to interrupt attention. Analog horror depends on this kind of grammar. If the story says every television in town simply changed because the night wanted it to, the effect becomes supernatural at once. But if the story says a trusted relay path carried the wrong message, the fear has to linger in the machinery. It asks what parts of the town were obedient. Which receiver listened? Which monitor waited? Which piece of equipment treated the incoming event as more important than the scheduled program? The term daisy chain sounds almost harmless. It suggests a child's necklace, flowers linked stem to stem, something simple and rural. In communications, the image is more procedural. A signal moves from one point to another, and the continuity of the chain is the useful feature. It does not require every participant to originate the warning. Many only have to monitor, receive, and respond. That is efficient during a real emergency. It is also why the fictional corruption feels intimate. A bad message, if it could dress itself convincingly enough as a warning, would not need to persuade the public first. It would need to be accepted by the chain. The channel name, Your Bedroom, becomes more frightening in that context because it is not merely a title. It is a violation inserted into an official shape. Viewers are trained to interpret emergency interruptions as external and civic. A flood warning is not about your sofa, even if you hear it from your sofa. A tornado warning is not about your television, even if the television carries it. The warning path speaks from the outside world into the home for the purpose of keeping people alive. The fictional channel reverses that direction. It uses the feeling of public warning to imply private knowledge. It says, in effect, the system that should tell you about danger outside has learned the name of the room you are in. It does not have to show anything clearly. It might only display a black field, a cable system font, a malformed crawl, and the words "your bedroom" repeating where a county name should be. The panic would come from mismatchu, emergency form, domestic address, civic authority, private dread. That mismatch is why the independent nature of the monitoring path matters for the archive tone. Modern viewers often imagine every intrusion as a hack in the internet sense. Stolen passwords, remote access, exposed dashboards, compromised servers. Those are real categories in the modern world, but they are not the only way television systems have ever been vulnerable or strange. The analog and transitional television environment had other choke points: headends, local origination equipment, off-air reception, relay paths, satellite feeds, modulators, and emergency override systems. A signal could be trusted because of where it appeared in the chain, not because a viewer selected it. In the fictional file, witnesses do not describe clicking anything. They do not describe searching for a stream or opening a link. They describe being interrupted. That word carries the old power of television. Interruption means the viewer's choice has already been defeated. The television is no longer behaving like an appliance under domestic control. It is behaving like an endpoint of a larger system. The daisy chain also complicates blame. A single corrupted screen in one home suggests a bad set, a miswired VCR, a cheap RF modulator, or some local interference. A town-wide display suggests distribution. But a warning that propagates through trusted monitoring relationships would leave a different kind of confusion behind. Some participants might only have repeated what they were configured to receive. Some operators might have encountered the event only after it had already acquired the appearance of legitimacy. Some viewers might have believed the alert precisely because other channels carried it too. In horror terms, that is the sick logic of confirmation. The second screen makes the first one feel real. The third makes it feel official. The fourth makes it feel unavoidable. The emergency alert system exists for reasons that are serious and necessary. Public warnings need priority. They need reach. They need the ability to break routine. The researched fact that the system can interrupt radio and television programming, including broadcast, cable, satellite, and wireline video services, is not sinister by itself. It is the point of the system. The public benefit depends on interruption being possible. But the fictional case asks what happens when the town cannot separate the legitimate power to interrupt from the content of the interruption. People know the tones. They know the crawl. They know the feeling of being told to stop what they are doing and listen. If that structure were ever made to carry something wrong, the panic would not begin after analysis. It would begin instantly, in the body, before verification, before the phone calls, before the station statements, before anyone could say whether it was a test, an error, a hoax, or something worse. That is why the archive keeps returning to trust rather than spectacle. The most terrifying version of your bedroom is not the loudest. It is the one that borrows the route designed for the public good. It does not need to defeat every household. It only needs to exploit the town's shared assumption that certain messages outrank doubt. And once that possibility is understood, the file is ready to leave the imagined town for a documented interruption that did happen. Not a bedroom channel. Not an emergency warning. But a real moment when ordinary viewers in Chicago, Illinois, watched familiar television give way to an unauthorized image, a masked figure, a broken broadcast, and a public record that never fully closed. From that point in the file, the fictional town has to be placed beside something documented, because otherwise the fear becomes too clean. A made-up channel called Your Bedroom can be shaped to fit the nightmare exactly. Real broadcast history is messier. It leaves dates, station names, wire service language, remembered fragments, and unanswered questions. It does not prove the bedroom channel. It does something colder. It proves that the ordinary television picture could be replaced. The place is Chicago, Illinois. The date is November 22nd, 1987. Two television stations were affected: WGN-TV Channel 9 and WTTW Channel 11. The event would later be remembered under a name that sounds almost too strange for an archive label: the Max Headroom Incident. That name can make the case feel more playful than it is. Max Headroom was already a recognizable media figure of the period, a jittering, artificial television personality associated with distortion, interruption, and the glossy unease of electronic culture. But the Chicago incident was not simply a joke arriving inside a joke. According to a UPI report published the next day, on November 23, 1987, a video pirate struck two Chicago television stations and replaced regular programming with skits featuring a figure resembling Max Headroom. The wording matters. Video pirate. 2 television stations. Replaced regular programming. A figure resembling Max Headroom. Those are not supernatural words. They are broadcast words. They belong to the world of stations, transmitters, unauthorized signals, programming schedules, and viewers who expected one thing and received another. The report did not describe a ghost in the set. It described an intrusion into a public communication system. That distinction is the reason Chicago belongs in this story. The horror is not that the impossible happened. The horror is that something very possible happened in a way that still feels wrong when placed in a living room. For the fictional case, the phrase, "your bedroom," depends on an impossible intimacy. A channel that should be public claims to know the most private room in the house. It turns the television from an appliance into an accusation. Chicago does not give us that. There is no documented bedroom channel in the Max Headroom incident, and the file should not pretend otherwise. But Chicago does give us the archive shadow behind the invention, the verified memory of ordinary broadcasting being abruptly displaced by an unauthorized masked performance. That is the hinge. A viewer does not need to understand the route of the signal to feel the violation. The station identifier, the schedule, the channel number, the shape of the evening, all of it says that the system is functioning as expected. Then, the picture changes. The trusted channel no longer behaves like itself. The room remains the same, but the authority inside the screen has been interrupted. This is why the Max Headroom incident has lasted in public memory in a way that many technical failures do not. A station outage can be frustrating. Static can be dismissed. A test pattern can be explained. But a masked figure entering the broadcast space creates a different kind of record. It suggests intention. It suggests that someone, somewhere, found a route into the signal chain and used it not merely to disrupt, but to perform. Performance is part of the unease. An interruption that simply cuts to black leaves room for engineering explanations. An interruption that replaces programming with skits, with a costumed or masked presence, with an image designed to be watched, feels like a message even when the message is incoherent. The screen is not just failing. It is being used. For an archive report, that is the difference between an accident and an intrusion. The viewer can tell, even without technical knowledge, that the event has a sender. The sender may be unidentified. The method may be uncertain in the public record. But the event carries the shape of human agency. Someone chose the mask. Someone chose the timing. Someone chose to let regular programming continue elsewhere, while this channel, for this audience, stopped being itself. The affected stations also matter because they were not obscure imaginary outlets. WGN-TV Channel 9 and WTTW Channel 11 were Chicago stations with ordinary audiences and established identities. The incident did not require viewers to be scanning the edge of the dial at 3 in the morning, hunting for weak signals and strange reflections. It entered known channels. That is what makes it useful to the larger fiction we are tracing. The nightmare of your bedroom is not strongest when the viewer discovers a forbidden channel. It is stronger when a familiar channel becomes forbidden without warning. There is a moral weight in that familiarity. Broadcast television was built around routine. People knew where to find local stations. They knew the numbers. They knew the time slots, the late-night habits, the voices and logos that marked a station as itself. When regular programming is replaced, the intrusion does not only occupy bandwidth, it trespasses on routine. It takes over a place in the household schedule. That is why the Chicago case sits naturally after the emergency warning chapters, even though it was not an emergency alert. The earlier question was about trusted interruption. What happens when a system designed to override normal programming is imagined as corrupted? Chicago offers a different but related lesson. Even without invoking the official emergency path, a television audience could still experience replacement. Not a warning from authority, but a break in authority. Not the state speaking over the program, but an unknown party stepping into the space where the station should have been. The distinction is important. The emergency alert system is frightening in fiction because it arrives with legitimacy. A broadcast intrusion is frightening because it arrives without it. One says, "Obey this because it is official." The other says, "Something unofficial has already reached you." Both forms unsettle the same domestic assumption. The viewer believes the television is a controlled object. It may be passive, commercial, annoying, loud, or manipulative, but it is not supposed to be porous in that way. The channel lineup may be selected by a cable company. The broadcast may be licensed. The station may be regulated. The program may be scheduled days in advance. The viewer lives inside all of those assurances without thinking about them. Then, for a brief interval, a stranger appears to demonstrate that the assurances are not the same as a locked door. The Max Headroom mask intensifies that demonstration because it is both face and refusal of face. A mask gives the audience a human shape while withholding the human being. It makes identification feel possible and impossible at the same time. The viewer sees a figure, but not a person who can be held in the ordinary way. In the language of analog nightmares, the mask becomes a kind of missing document. It proves presence while protecting identity. The UPI description, with its phrase, "a figure resembling Max Headroom," preserves that uncertainty. It does not grant the intruder a stable name. It does not say Max Headroom appeared, as if the broadcast had been invaded by a character from television itself. It says a figure resembling him, a likeness, an imitation, a constructed face arriving through an unauthorized signal. The archive is careful there, and the caution makes the image more disturbing, not lessening, because the most durable horror in this case is not the content of the skits. It is the unresolved replacement, the knowledge that on a specific night in Chicago, viewers watching known stations saw programming give way to something unauthorized, masked, and strange. The event was public enough to be reported. It was specific enough to be dated. It was technical enough to belong to communications history. And yet, as a cultural memory, it remains open at the edges. That open edge is where the fictional bedroom channel finds its realism. Not in the claim that Chicago showed bedrooms. It did not. Not in the claim that the same mechanism would explain a town-wide channel called Your Bedroom. The record does not give us that. The realism is more basic and more unsettling. A television channel can be a public promise, and that promise can be broken in front of everyone. Once that promise is broken, the living room changes. The screen is still only glass, phosphor, speaker, cabinet, signal. But the viewer has learned that the picture is not guaranteed to belong to the institution named on the channel. The familiar number can carry an unfamiliar will. The local station can become a doorway for someone who is not invited into the room. And in Chicago, on November 22nd, 1987, that lesson arrived twice. One interruption is already enough to become a story. Two interruptions make the story harder to dismiss as a single technical hiccup or a brief prank at the edge of perception. The second one is the version that analog horror keeps circling back to because it happened during routine viewing inside the ordinary expectation of a program already in progress. WTTW's own retrospective would later identify that interruption as occurring during a broadcast of Doctor Who, with station personnel describing the sudden replacement of the program by a Max Headroom mask. That is where the archive narrows. Not to a theory of who did it, and not yet to the unresolved identity behind the mask, but to the moment of substitution itself, a familiar program, a domestic audience, and then another face where the broadcast should have been. The archive narrows because the second interruption was not experienced as an abstract failure of infrastructure. It arrived inside a program people had chosen to watch. WTTW's retrospective identifies the interrupted broadcast as Doctor Who, and that detail matters. It gives the incident a room, a pace, a normal evening shape. Viewers were not scanning through fringe channels. They were not waiting for pirate television. They were not gathered around a monitor in a station control room looking for evidence of a problem. They were at home, watching a familiar program when the program was suddenly replaced. That replacement is the center of this chapter. In the public memory of the Max Headroom incident, the mask tends to dominate. It is the image that survives because it is simple enough to describe and strange enough to linger. A figure resembling Max Headroom inserted into regular programming without authorization. A UPI report published on November 23, 1987, described a video pirate striking two Chicago television stations and replacing regular programming with skits featuring that figure. The previous chapter used that report to establish the broader event. But WTTW's Doctor Who Interruption gives the archive a different kind of charge. It is not just that something unauthorized appeared. It is that it appeared where routine had already made the viewer defenseless. Routine is a form of permission. A household turns on the set. The channel is known. The hour is known. The station has a place in the mental map of the city. WTTW Channel 11 was not an unknown signal drifting in from the edge of reception. It was a Chicago public television station, part of the regular broadcasting landscape. Doctor Who, as a scheduled program, carried its own expectations. Whatever the episode was doing at that moment, the viewer understood the category of the experience. Science fiction. Public television. Evening viewing. A familiar station. A familiar title. A program already in progress. Then the category changed. Station personnel, as later described in WTTW's retrospective, recalled the sudden replacement of the program with a max headroom mask. The wording is important because it keeps the event at the level where the audience actually felt it. Not a theory. Not a complete technical reconstruction. A sudden replacement. The show was there, and then it was not. Another face occupied the channel. The broadcast did not ask for consent. It did not wait for the viewer to change inputs or tune manually to something hidden. It used the authority of the channel already selected. This is why the Doctor Who Interruption is so useful to an archive report horror structure built around a fictional channel called Your Bedroom. The fictional phrase is more intimate, more invasive, and not a documented historical event. But its emotional plausibility depends on the same ordinary vulnerability. The most frightening version is not a forbidden channel that only appears to people who go looking for it. It is a normal channel that betrays its normality. The television is already on. The viewer is already settled. The room has already accepted the screen as background, company, or ritual. Then, the screen changes the terms. In a theatrical horror scene, a character might discover a hidden frequency. They might turn a dial past the last marked channel and find something that should not exist. That has its own appeal, but it also creates distance. The viewer inside the story has made a choice. They have crossed into the unknown. The WTTW incident is colder because it does not rely on curiosity. It relies on trust. People were watching the program that was supposed to be there. The intrusion came to them. That distinction is also why the bedroom image in our fictional case works better as quiet dread than as spectacle. A town-wide channel named Your Bedroom would not be frightening only because of what it shows. It would be frightening because of where it appears in the viewing chain. If it behaves like a normal channel, if it occupies a public, educational, or governmental slot, if it rides a cable head-end feed, if it interrupts through a trusted override path, then it does not need to look impossible at first. It can arrive with the same blunt confidence as any legitimate transmission. The channel label may be absurd, but the mechanism feels bureaucratic. The horror is not that the television has become magical. The horror is that the television system has always been built to let one signal replace another. The Doctor Who detail brings that principle into the home. It reminds us that an interruption does not begin in the viewer's understanding. It begins as a sensory fact. The picture changes. The sound changes. The narrative that had been occupying the room is displaced. For a few seconds, the mind tries to categorize it. Technical trouble. Station error. A prank. A tape problem. A local break gone wrong. In that short interval, the home becomes a receiving site rather than a private space. The set is no longer furniture. It is the visible end of a chain whose other end is somewhere else. Earlier parts of this file have described several possible points in such a chain: the cable head end, the local origination channel, the emergency alert path, the daisy chain logic of monitored signals. The max headroom interruption does not prove that any one of those mechanisms explains our fictional town-wide case. It does something more limited and more valuable. It proves that ordinary viewers could encounter unauthorized replacement within regular television. It proves that the domestic screen could be made to carry an alien presence under the cover of a known channel. There is a temptation, when discussing the max headroom incident, to turn immediately toward method. How was it done? Which link was exploited? Which transmitter path was vulnerable? Those questions belong to the technical file, and some of them remain unresolved in the public record. But before method, there is experience, WTTW's Doctor Who broadcast was interrupted, and viewers saw a masked figure where the program should have been. That experience is the seed that later analog nightmares grow from. It also explains why the mask matters differently from an ordinary face. A face can be identified, remembered, recognized, or placed. A mask refuses those comforts. In the WTTW interruption, the Max Headroom likeness already belonged to media culture, already looked artificial, already carried the hard shine of television satire and video-era performance. But in the intrusion, that artificiality became part of the violation. The mask did not simply appear on television. It appeared as if television itself had produced it, as if the medium had briefly chosen its own spokesman. That is the bridge between the documented incident and the fictional channel name. Your Bedroom, as a title, would have the same cruel precision. It would not need to explain itself. Like the mask, it would announce that the viewer's expected relationship to the screen had changed. The set would no longer be showing a distant studio, a recorded program, or a scheduled broadcast. It would be implying proximity. It would be implying knowledge. It would be using the blunt grammar of a channel listing to name the one place the viewer believed was outside the broadcast system. The Doctor Who interruption teaches us that the first layer of fear is not content. It is substitution. The regular program becomes absent. The station identity becomes uncertain. The viewer's choice becomes irrelevant. Once that has happened, the intruding image does not have to be elaborate. A mask is enough. A phrase is enough. A room title is enough. The power comes from the fact that the television did not become strange after being invited to do so. It became strange while performing its most ordinary function. This is also why the incident remained so durable in analog horror memory. It belongs to an era when television still felt like a continuous signal entering the house, not a menu of files individually requested. A household set could be tuned to WTTW Channel 11, receiving public television in Chicago, and then the channel could be overtaken by something unauthorized. The event did not require the viewer to understand the broadcast path. It only required the viewer to witness the path failing in public. And because the second interruption happened during a familiar program, it leaves behind a particular kind of afterimage. Not just the mask itself, but the interrupted expectation around it. The viewer remembers what they meant to watch. They remember the ordinary room. They remember the feeling that the station had been replaced from somewhere outside their control. That is the emotional architecture behind the fictional town-wide channel. The title, Your Bedroom, is invented, but the weakness it exploits is not. For the archive, then, the WTTW Doctor Who interruption is not evidence of a bedroom broadcast. It is evidence of a boundary failing. Public signal crossed into private routine. A familiar program became a delivery surface for an unauthorized image. A city watched something that was not supposed to be there, and the full explanation did not arrive with the picture. That last absence is where the file darkens again. If the incident had been immediately solved in public, if the root had been cleanly demonstrated and the responsible parties placed neatly into the record, the mask would now sit more comfortably as a case study. But the power of the Max Headroom interruption is partly that the figure did not bring a name with it. It replaced the program, occupied the channel, and then withdrew into an unresolved public memory. The mask remained visible. The person behind it did not. The absence of a name is not a small detail in this file. It changes the shape of the incident. A solved intrusion can be placed on a shelf. It can be reduced to equipment, motive, access, prosecution, penalty, and lesson learned. An unresolved intrusion keeps moving. It remains partly technical, partly cultural, and partly imaginative, because the public record never gives the viewer the final relief of a face behind the mask. That is why the Max Headroom incident matters so much to analog horror. Not because it proves the fiction. It does not. Not because it shows that a channel called Your Bedroom could appear in a town and turn every private room into a broadcast source. It does not show that either. Its importance is narrower and more durable. On November 22, 1987, in Chicago, Illinois, unauthorized video interrupted WGN-TV Channel 9 and WTTW Channel 11. A UPI report published the next day described a video pirate striking two television stations and replacing regular programming with skits featuring a figure resembling Max Headroom. WTTW's own retrospective later identified the second interruption as taking place during Doctor Who. Those facts are solid enough to stand on, but around them is the space that never closed. The perpetrators were not publicly identified. That sentence is plain, almost administrative, but it is the sentence that keeps the event from becoming only a curiosity. It means the archive has a visible act and no publicly confirmed actor. It has affected stations, a date, a city, a remembered image, and later institutional retrospectives, but not the ordinary conclusion that most official narratives try to provide. The mask entered the record. The person or people behind it did not. For horror, that difference is decisive. If a case is solved, fear becomes a diagram. The audience can point to a known route, a known operator, a known mistake. The story may still be disturbing, but it has edges. It becomes something like a safety memo with atmosphere. This was the weak point. This was the person. This was the method. This was the consequence. An open file behaves differently. It asks the viewer to stay with uncertainty. It does not allow every loose end to be tied to a culprit's name. It does not allow every rumor to become fact either. The responsible archive-report position is to resist that temptation, to say only what can be said. Unauthorized video appeared. 2 Chicago stations were affected. The image resembled Mac's headroom. The second interruption occurred during Doctor Who. The perpetrators were not publicly identified. The rest must be handled carefully, because analog horror thrives on the same gaps that bad history can exploit. Later accounts and discussions have associated the Chicago incident with broadcast transmission infrastructure in the city, including references to the John Hancock Center. That association matters because the John Hancock Center is part of the broader memory of Chicago television transmission infrastructure. It gives the story a vertical shape: towers, relays, antennas, buildings above the city, signals moving through the air before entering living rooms. But a careful account cannot turn later association into certainty about the exact technical route. The file does not become stronger by pretending to know what it does not know. That caution is part of the horror, not a weakness in it. The frightening thing is not that every detail is confirmed. The frightening thing is that the confirmed details are enough. A major city saw an unauthorized broadcast interruption. The event was noticed, described, and investigated afterward. Yet, the public record did not close with identified perpetrators. The old system could produce a public spectacle without producing a public answer. This is the emotional mechanism underneath the fictional channel called Your Bedroom. The imagined town-wide event depends on a contradiction, something intimate appearing through a mass distribution system. A bedroom is the place where a person expects the least audience. A television channel is designed for an audience. The title fuses them. But the unease does not begin with the bedroom. It begins with the discovery that the screen is part of a chain the viewer does not control. The Mac's headroom intrusion made that chain visible by breaking it. For a short time, the expected relationship between viewer and broadcaster failed. Viewers had not invited the masked figure. The station had not intended to transmit it. The program had not contained it. Yet there it was, occupying the same surface as legitimate television. The domestic set did not explain the difference. It simply displayed what arrived. That is one of the central lessons of analog nightmares. The screen was familiar, but the path to the screen was not. A viewer knew the channel number, the program title, the station logo, perhaps the schedule printed in a newspaper or TV guide. But beyond that were transmitters, links, receivers, headends, modulators, antennas, control rooms, monitoring equipment, and regulatory boundaries that most people never saw. The home receiver made the system feel personal. The infrastructure behind it was anything but personal. An unresolved mask exposes that mismatch. It says, you recognized the image, but not the route. You saw the interruption, but not the hand. You experienced the failure from inside your home, but the cause belonged to a system spread across buildings, equipment, airspace, and institutional responsibility. This is also why invented certainty would make the story smaller. If we assigned culprits without evidence or claimed a precise technical method beyond the supported record, the incident would become less archival and more theatrical. The unknown would be replaced by a convenient villain. But the real power of the Chicago case is that it refuses that convenience. It remains public and incomplete at the same time. Analog horror often imitates that incompleteness. It gives the audience degraded tapes, partial logs, missing minutes, unclear station identifications, emergency tones without context, and faces that appear without names. These devices are frightening because they resemble the way real media archives can fail to settle the past. A recording may survive when the explanation does not. A viewer's memory may preserve the shock better than the mechanism. A station may acknowledge the event without being able to offer the public a complete ending. The Max Headroom mask is therefore more than an image. It is a lesson in unresolved mediation. It shows how a broadcast system can create an event witnessed by many people, discussed afterward, preserved in recollection and retrospective accounts, and still not fully closed on. The event was not private. It was not hidden. Its uncertainty did not come from secrecy alone. It came from the fact that public visibility and public explanation are not the same thing. That distinction is essential to the fictional archive we are following. If a town's television switched to a channel called Your Bedroom, the first terror would be the image. The second would be the implication that someone had access. But the longest-lasting terror would be the investigation failing to produce a final answer, not knowing whether the origin was a cable headend, a local origination feed, a public, educational, or governmental channel, an emergency path, a relay link, or a broadcast intrusion. Not knowing whether the name on the channel was a taunt, a label, a routing error, or something worse. Not knowing if the event was local, upstream, deliberate, accidental, or merely made to appear that way. The open file is where analog fear matures. At first, the viewer asks, "What am I seeing?" Then, "Who is sending it?" Then, "How did it get here?" But if the record remains incomplete, the final question becomes harder to live with. What else could have passed through the same route without being understood? That question does not require supernatural certainty. It does not require the television to become a magic object. It only requires trust in a system to be damaged. Broadcast television, cable distribution, emergency overrides, and local channels all depend on assumptions about authority and origin. The viewer assumes that the channel belongs to someone legitimate. The station assumes its signal path is under control. The public assumes that investigation can turn violation into explanation. The unresolved mask interrupts those assumptions. It does not tell us that every screen is watching. It tells us that there was a time when many screens could be made to show something unauthorized, and afterward, the public might still be left without the name behind it. That is enough to haunt the archive. A mask on television is already unsettling. A mask that remains unsolved becomes a permanent opening in the record. And once that opening exists, the threat model widens. The question is no longer only whether a local signal can be interrupted, or whether a city's viewers can be surprised by an intruder in the broadcast chain. The next wound sits farther upstream, where a single altered feed can travel outward as if it were official programming, passing from one point of control into many homes below. The next wound sits farther upstream because a local interruption, however disturbing, still feels bounded by geography. A tower has a service area. A cable system has a franchise map. A head end has a building somewhere, with racks, modulators, receivers, and people who know which door sticks in winter. Even a citywide intrusion can be imagined as something that happened there, to those viewers, along that chain. Satellite distribution changes the emotional size of the file. On April 27, 1986, the incident remembered as Captain Midnight interrupted HBO's satellite-distributed signal during a film broadcast. Historical accounts associate the incident with HBO and the satellite Galaxy 1. Contemporary reporting and the legal aftermath identified John R. McDougal as the Captain Midnight operator. Those facts place the event in a different category from the local shadows we have been following. This was not only a question of a station's transmitter or a cable channel in one town, or a public access slot left unattended after hours. It was a demonstration that an alteration made upstream could appear downstream as though the program itself had changed. That is the part that matters for the channel called Your Bedroom. In a town story, the easiest explanation is local. Something enters the cable head end. Something is inserted into a local origination feed. Something disguises itself as a public, educational, or governmental channel. Something abuses an emergency path. Those routes are intimate. They have municipal texture. They explain why one town would wake to the same impossible label on the same impossible channel. But Captain Midnight forces the archive to widen its frame. The question becomes less domestic and more systemic. What if the signal was already wounded before it reached the local system? What if the town was not the origin point at all, but only one of many places where a damaged feed arrived obediently, decoded by equipment that had no reason to doubt it? That is the horror of upstream control. It does not have to knock on every door. It does not have to visit every television. It only has to enter a path that many televisions already trust. By the 1980s, satellite distribution had become part of the way television traveled. Premium programming, cable feeds, and distant signals could be gathered, sent, received, processed, and redistributed. To viewers at home, the route was mostly invisible. A subscriber turned on a set and selected a channel. The image appeared. The living room version of television was simple: program, channel, screen. The infrastructure version was layered: uplinks, satellites, downlinks, cable systems, headends, receivers, modulators, amplifiers, and miles of coaxial plant. The Captain Midnight incident is useful because it reveals that the layers mattered. An interruption did not need to originate inside every living room, and it did not need to defeat every television set separately. It could affect a shared source. If the source was important enough, and if enough systems depended on it, the result could feel much larger than the single point where the act began. In ordinary language, viewers might say HBO was interrupted. That is true at the level of experience. They were watching a film broadcast, and an unauthorized message appeared in place of the expected signal. But for this archive, the deeper lesson is that the screen was not the first place where the violation occurred. The screen was the visible end of a path. The wound was upstream. This distinction helps keep the fictional case from becoming too magical. A channel called Your Bedroom does not become frightening because every television has secretly developed intelligence. It becomes frightening because television has always depended on systems of selection and distribution that most viewers never see. The home receiver is personal furniture, but the channel is not personal. The channel is a decision made elsewhere and delivered inward. That is why satellite scale is so unnerving. In a local intrusion, the story can still be measured against a town's edges. There is a map. There are streets where the signal fades. There are neighborhoods that may have a different cable provider or an antenna pointed in another direction. A satellite distributed feed unsettles that comfort. The altered signal may be received by many downstream systems, and each of those systems may pass it along as routine programming. The intrusion can wear the face of legitimacy simply by arriving through the same route legitimacy uses. Captain Midnight also changes the meaning of identification. Unlike the Max Headroom case, where the perpetrators were not publicly identified, the Captain Midnight file has a name in the record: John R. MacDougall. It has a date. It has institutions attached to it. HBO, Galaxy 1. It belongs not only to folklore, but to reporting and legal aftermath. In one sense, that makes it less ghostly. The mask is not unsolved in the same way. The archive can point to an operator, but being solved does not make it harmless as a precedent. A solved intrusion can be more technically instructive than an unsolved one. It shows not only that an unauthorized signal appeared, but that the event was legible enough afterward to enter public record, investigation, and consequence. It shows that the impossible evening was not impossible. It had a mechanism. It had a person. It had a path. And once a path is acknowledged, fiction can ask what other messages might travel along comparable routes and what they would look like when they arrived without explanation. For the fictional channel, this is the moment the premise stops being only a municipal nightmare. The title, Your Bedroom, still feels local, almost cruelly specific. It suggests the private room, the bed, the dresser, the lamp, the half-open closet door, the television at the foot of the room, glowing after midnight. But the delivery of such a title could be broader than the room it names. A signal can be intimate in content and industrial in distribution. It can say something that feels aimed at one household while moving through equipment designed for thousands. That contradiction is the center of the fear. Broadcast and cable systems were built to make one signal available to many people at once. The very achievement of the system was sameness. A film, a news broadcast, a public warning, a sports event, a school board meeting, a local bulletin crawl, all could be sent outward so that separate homes received a shared experience. Analog horror turns that achievement slightly. It asks what happens when the shared experience is not wanted, not scheduled, and not explainable by the people who receive it. Captain Midnight gives that question a historical hinge. It demonstrates that the shared source can be challenged. It also reminds us that the television image is not necessarily local to the set, or even local to the town. The image may have traveled through a chain so long that the viewer only sees the last few inches of it, the glowing glass surface, and mistakes that surface for the whole event. In the archive reconstruction of your bedroom, this matters for witness statements. A resident saying, "It was on my television," is telling the truth, but not the whole technical story. The image was on the television because it was somewhere earlier in the distribution chain. A resident saying, "Everyone saw it," may also be telling the truth, but the word everyone needs investigation. Everyone on the same cable system? Everyone receiving the same local origination channel? Everyone downstream of a particular feed? Everyone whose equipment trusted the same input? The scale of the horror depends on the answer. If the intrusion was local, the town itself is the body of the event. If the intrusion was upstream, the town may be only a symptom. Its viewers may have been among many who received the altered signal, or among a smaller group whose local system happened to pass it through at the wrong time. In that version, the archive's missing pieces become more disturbing. The absence of outside reports might suggest containment, or it might suggest that other systems cut away, masked the feed, failed to log it, or never connected the event to the same source. We do not need to invent certainty here. The real lesson from Captain Midnight is not that every upstream path is easy to seize, and not that satellite systems are inherently helpless. The lesson is narrower and therefore stronger. There is documented precedent for an unauthorized message interrupting a satellite-distributed television signal, and that kind of interruption matters because satellite feeds can serve many downstream viewers. It is a scale lesson. It is a trust lesson. The viewer trusts the channel because it arrives with the ordinary weight of infrastructure behind it. The cable system trusts the feed because it comes from a source it expects. The receiver trusts the signal because trust, in this context, is not emotional. It is procedural. Equipment passes along what it is configured to pass along. A television does not ask whether the message belongs. It draws the lines, refreshes the picture, and fills the room. That is why the phrase, "your bedroom becomes worse" when imagined upstream. A local pirate channel can feel like a trespasser standing outside one town's window. An upstream alteration feels like someone changed the blueprint from which many windows were being cut. The violation is no longer only that a private room appears on a public channel. The violation is that the public channel may have been injured before it ever became local, and every downstream system may have helped deliver the wound. By the time the image reaches the viewer, it looks like television. That may be the most important sentence in this part of the file. Not because it explains the incident fully, but because it explains why people stay in their chairs for the first few seconds. They do not yet know they are seeing a violation. They are seeing programming. A message. A card. A title. A picture. The apparatus of normalcy is still intact. The channel number is still where it belongs. The glow still comes from the familiar corner of the room. The voice, if there is a voice, still arrives through the same speaker that carried movies, alerts, commercials, weather, sermons, cartoons, and late-night reruns. Captain Midnight reminds us that the familiar path can carry an unfamiliar command. And once the archive reaches that point, the technical question begins to harden into a legal one. The systems we have been tracing are not just haunted corridors of signal. They are regulated communications paths, licensed operations, authorized services, and devices allowed to function only within boundaries. To alter them deliberately is not merely eerie. It crosses into the forbidden edge of interference, where the law has already drawn lines around what a signal is allowed to do and what no operator is allowed to do to someone else's transmission. After Captain Midnight, the archive can no longer pretend that a signal intrusion is only a strange picture on a screen. It is also a trespass against an ordered system. The ordinary viewer may experience the event as interruption, confusion, or fear. The regulator sees something more specific. One communication path has been deliberately forced against another. One authorized transmission has been displaced, obstructed, or distorted by an outside act. That distinction matters for a story like Your Bedroom, because the horror depends on a forbidden crossing. A private room appears where a public channel should be. A local television system behaves as if it has been given a new command. The viewer sees intimacy arriving through infrastructure. But beneath the image, before the face or the room or the impossible title card, there is a legal line. The signal is not supposed to be there. Federal law draws that line in direct language. 47 U.S.C. Section 333 prohibits willful or malicious interference with the radio communications of any station licensed or authorized under United States communications law or operated by the United States government. The sentence is not written like folklore. It does not need ghosts, masks, or urban legends. It gives the forbidden act a name: interference. It attaches the prohibition not to whether the intruding material is frightening, obscene, political, comic, or absurd, but to the act of willfully or maliciously interfering with authorized communications. This is where the earlier incidents become more than atmosphere. The Max Headroom interruption in Chicago on November 22, 1987, was disturbing because viewers saw familiar programming replaced by unauthorized video. The Captain Midnight incident on April 27, 1986, was disturbing because an unauthorized message entered the satellite distribution path associated with HBO and Galaxy One. But the legal horror is quieter. It is not only that something strange appeared, it is that a regulated path, built to carry a known service, was made to carry something else. In the fictional town file, the channel name Your Bedroom functions like a confession and a threat at the same time. It does not merely say, "I am broadcasting." It says, "I have reached the place that was not offered." But if we strip away the title and look only at the communications problem, the question becomes colder. What licensed or authorized communication was being interfered with? Was a local broadcast station displaced? Was a cable system carrying a feed that had been altered before it reached subscribers? Was a public, educational, or governmental channel commandeered inside the local franchise structure? Was an emergency override path imitated or misused? Each route has its own technical shape. Each route also has a boundary around it. The law does not make the screen safe. It makes the violation legible. That is an important difference. Regulation can define an unauthorized act after it happens. It can create penalties, standards, conditions, and duties. It can tell operators what they must avoid and investigators what category of event they may be looking at. But it cannot guarantee that the first viewer who sees the wrong image will understand the machinery behind it. In the living room, the incident begins as sensation. The channel changes. The program vanishes. The title appears. The household recognizes its own architecture in a place where no household should be visible. Only later does the file begin to ask whether this was signal intrusion, system misuse, local origination abuse, emergency path corruption, or harmful interference. The phrase harmful interference carries its own technical weight. Under FCC Part 15 rules, unlicensed radio frequency devices are allowed to operate only under conditions. 47 CFR Section 15.5 states the general operating condition. Such devices may not cause harmful interference, and they must accept interference received, including interference that may cause undesired operation. This is one of those regulatory sentences that can seem ordinary until it is placed beside a television set in a dark room. A device may be legal. It may be familiar. It may be sold for household use. But its permission to operate is conditional. It lives beneath authorized services. It must not harm them, and it must tolerate the presence of stronger or protected signals around it. That conditional status is one of the hidden foundations of everyday electronic life. The home is full of devices that seem private because they are owned privately. They sit on shelves, desks, nightstands, and entertainment centers. They belong to a household. They are plugged into domestic outlets. They are touched by family members, repaired badly, ignored for years, or left blinking in spare rooms. But in radio frequency terms, private ownership does not mean isolation. Devices can radiate. Devices can receive. Devices can be affected by the electromagnetic environment around them. The law recognizes this by setting conditions for unlicensed operation. The permission is real, but it is not sovereign. For the archive, this introduces a different kind of dread from the one we found at the head end or the satellite uplink. Earlier, the danger sat in centralized places: a cable head end, a broadcast transmitter, a relay path, an uplink, a station control room, a trusted alert chain. Those places are distant from the bedroom. They can be imagined as locked rooms with equipment racks and call signs and trained operators. The viewer may never see them. The viewer only receives what they distribute. Part 15 brings the boundary closer. It reminds us that the home itself is part of the signal environment, not in the exaggerated sense that every object is secretly a camera, and not as a claim that a television can simply look back into a bedroom. The source-grounded claim is more restrained and more useful. Ordinary radio frequency devices operate under rules because emissions, reception, and interference are not confined by the emotional meaning of a wall. A bedroom wall is a boundary for the body. It is not an absolute boundary for electromagnetic behavior. This is why the fictional title, Your Bedroom, is so effective. It attaches an intimate word to a public channel, but it also points toward a technical unease that predates digital networks. In the analog era, the screen did not feel like a sealed library of chosen files. It felt like an endpoint in a flow. A stronger signal, a nearer signal, a privileged signal, or a misrouted signal could make itself known as snow, ghosting, override, distortion, or replacement. Even when the law was clear, the experience could be ambiguous. A viewer did not hear 47 USC Section 333. A viewer heard a buzz, saw a flash, watched a picture bend, and wondered whether the set was broken or whether something outside the house had found its way in. The boundary of the forbidden signal is therefore both legal and emotional. The legal boundary says, authorized communications may not be willfully or maliciously interfered with. The operating boundary for unlicensed devices says, you may function, but only if you do not cause harmful interference, and only if you accept interference from authorized stations and other radiators. The emotional boundary says, the room is mine, the set is mine, the night is mine, and the channel should not know where I sleep. Horror crosses all three at once. It begins by violating expectation. The television does not show the program selected by the viewer. Then it violates authority. The transmission path carries material it was not supposed to carry. Finally, it violates domestic meaning. It names the most private space in the house as if it were just another local service, another municipal bulletin board, another channel in the lineup. The legal language is not ornamental here. It is what keeps the nightmare from dissolving into pure impossibility. The existence of a prohibition means the system has contemplated the act. The existence of operating conditions means the spectrum is already understood as a shared and contested environment. The existence of licensed and authorized communications means there are paths that belong to someone, duties attached to their operation, and consequences when those paths are attacked. But the archive also has to be careful. These statutes and rules do not prove that a town-wide channel called Your Bedroom ever appeared. They do not prove a particular route, culprit, device, or method. They give us a map of boundaries. They show why a deliberate intrusion into a communication system is not merely a prank with a signal attached. It is an act against a regulated order, and the order exists because the air, the cable plant, the transmitter, the receiver, and the ordinary machine in the house are all capable of meeting in ways the viewer may never see. That is where the file narrows again. From stations and satellite feeds, from cable head ends and emergency paths, from public channels and forbidden interference, the focus returns to the room itself. Not because the room is magically exposed, but because the room is crowded with permitted machines. They hum under conditional rules. They accept interference. They may cause none. They sit beside the bed and under the television and behind the wall plate, turning the private home into a small, ordinary province of the larger electromagnetic world. The file narrows to the bedroom because the bedroom is not outside the system. It only feels that way. After the tower, after the satellite path, after the cable head end, after the emergency override and the legal boundary around malicious interference, the room appears small enough to be safe. A bed, a lamp, a television on a dresser, a cable line coming through the wall, a clock radio, perhaps, or a game console, or a videocassette recorder with its own little channel switch on the back. These are not stations. They are not licensed broadcasters. They do not announce themselves with call signs. They are ordinary machines. But ordinary machines still live in the same electromagnetic world as the rest of the network. That is why FCC Part 15 belongs in the archive. It is not a dramatic piece of law. It is not written like a warning in a horror story. It is the kind of regulatory framework most viewers never think about, even while using devices that depend on it every day. Under the general operating conditions in 47 CFR Section 15.5, unlicensed radio frequency devices are permitted to operate only under conditions. They must not cause harmful interference. They must accept interference from authorized stations and from other radiators. Those words are quiet, but they disturb the idea of the sealed room. Must accept interference. Must not cause harmful interference. They describe a world in which the household device is not sovereign. It is allowed to function, but not in isolation. It is tolerated as long as it behaves. It is not promised a clean environment. It is not guaranteed silence. In the fictional record of the Your Bedroom channel, this matters because the terror does not begin with a ghost looking through plaster. It begins with a room full of objects that already receive, radiate, relay, convert, and respond. The bedroom is private, socially, legally, emotionally. Technically, it is crossed by signals and conductors. There is a coaxial cable behind the television. There may be an antenna lead, a set-top box, a radio alarm, remote controls, switching power supplies, an old RF modulator, a telephone line, or a cable drop that continues through the house. Some devices are receivers. Some are low-power radiators. Some are connected to systems that reach the head end. Some merely sit there, emitting small, lawful, incidental traces of operation. Part 15 does not say that these machines can do anything monstrous. It says almost the opposite. It describes limits. It describes restraint. It describes the conditions under which unlicensed devices can share space with licensed and authorized radio services. But those limits also reveal the shape of the environment. The home is not empty air. It is a crowded technical address. The analog era made that easier to feel. Before the full-power analog broadcast transition ended in the United States on June 12, 2009, American viewers were used to screens that reacted visibly to the conditions around them. Snow was not a metaphor. It was a texture. A weak signal did not fail politely. It crawled, rolled, tore, bent, hissed, and flashed. The television did not always seem like a sealed appliance receiving a finished product. It felt like an instrument pointed into a disturbed field. This is part of the reason the phrase "your bedroom" can become frightening without requiring the story to leave the ground. The title of the channel is impossible as a service name, but its route through fear is familiar. The viewer does not need to understand modulation schemes or cable distribution architecture. The viewer only needs to know the feeling of a screen doing something it was not asked to do. A channel that was blank becomes active. A local slot becomes personal. A familiar input becomes uncertain. The house begins to feel less like shelter and more like a node. Part 15 devices are not the same as broadcast stations, and they should not be treated as if they are. That distinction matters. A licensed television station operates under a different kind of authority than an unlicensed household device. A cable operator, a satellite uplink, a public educational or governmental channel, and an emergency alert system participant all belong to larger structures of permission and responsibility. A household device under Part 15 occupies a smaller and more conditional place. It is allowed to use or emit radio frequency energy within limits, and in exchange, it must accept a lack of protection from certain interference. For horror, that conditional status is the useful fact. The clock radio is not evil. The remote control is not a transmitter in a conspiracy. The old videocassette recorder with a Channel 3 or Channel 4 output is not a broadcast station in miniature, not in the legal or practical sense that would explain a town-wide event. But each object contributes to a domestic landscape in which the boundary between inside and outside is already technical rather than absolute. The bedroom in the case file is therefore not a pure location. It is an endpoint, a place where signals become images, where distributed programming becomes light on a wall, where a centralized decision made elsewhere appears as a private experience. Earlier in the archive, The headend was the town's hidden throat because it could take many inputs and make one local output. Here, the bedroom is the final mouth of that system. It speaks only because something upstream gives it a voice. But the room also contains its own small machinery, its own unlicensed devices, its own wiring, and its own receptibility to the invisible traffic around it. The fear depends on a contradiction. Viewers think of the bedroom as the least public room in the house. Television infrastructure treats it as one more service point. A drop, an outlet, a receiver, a subscriber location. The system does not care whether the set is in a den, a kitchen, a motel room, or beside a sleeping child. Distribution is indifferent to intimacy. The same channel map enters all rooms that are connected to it. A channel called Your Bedroom would exploit that indifference. It would make the most personal name arrive by the most impersonal route. There is also an archival modesty here that should not be lost. Part 15 rules do not support a claim that every television in town could be turned into a camera. They do not prove that a bedroom could be observed through an ordinary television set. They do not explain the impossible image at the center of the fictional incident. What they provide is a regulated vocabulary for the unease. The machines in the room are not outside communications law. They are part of a managed interference environment. They are expected to coexist with stronger, more official, more protected signals. They are told, in effect, that they may speak softly but must not complain if the authorized world speaks over them. That language has a particular dread when brought indoors. Must accept interference sounds harmless when printed in a compliance manual. It sounds different when imagined beside a bed at night, when the television is off but the set-top box still glows, when the clock radio holds the time in red segments, when the cable line disappears into the wall and no one in the room knows where it goes next. The law is not haunted. The wiring is not haunted. Yet the arrangement makes haunting feel technically literate. The fictional town's mistake in the days after the incident was to look for a single violated boundary. People asked how the channel entered the cable system, who inserted the feed, which operator failed, which transmitter was touched, which rule was broken. Those are necessary questions, but they leave out the quieter shock. The channel did not merely enter a system. It arrived in rooms that had already been prepared to receive. Every ordinary machine in the house had trained the viewer to trust proximity. The television belonged to the family because it sat in the family's room. The radio belonged to the nightstand because it woke the person who slept there. The cable outlet belonged to the wall because the wall was part of the house. But communications infrastructure is not organized by sentiment. It is organized by signal paths, permissions, tolerances, and points of connection. The room is private because people agree to treat it that way. The machines are not built from agreement. They are built from circuits. In the archive recordings, this is where witnesses begin to sound less certain about what they saw. Earlier accounts describe the channel name, the sudden replacement of programming, the sense that the town had been addressed all at once. Later accounts turn inward. People remember the arrangement of their own rooms. The television facing the bed, the door half open, the laundry chair visible in the corner, the mirror across from the dresser. They describe not evidence, but vulnerability. They remember suddenly noticing every object with a cord. That turn inward is the essential movement of the case. A town-wide intrusion is frightening because it is large. A bedroom channel is frightening because it is intimate. Part 15 sits between those scales. It reminds us that the large electromagnetic order does not stop politely at the front door, and the small devices of the home are permitted participants in that order, even when they seem too mundane to matter. The archive cannot honestly say that the machines in the bedroom revealed the bedroom. It can say something more restrained and perhaps more unsettling. The room was never technically silent. It was full of receivers, conductors, emissions, and rules. It was a domestic space, but also a terminal point in a networked environment. The television did not need to become magical to feel like a witness. It only needed to remind the viewer that a screen is an electrical surface, and that electrical surfaces do not always keep their secrets in the way people expect. That unease leads from the ordinary household rulebook toward a more specific fear from the older computer age, the possibility that displays themselves might leak information, not as folklore and not as proof of the bedroom channel, but as a documented research anxiety with a name, a date, and a paper trail. The question becomes narrower and colder. If a screen can receive a signal, and if a screen can emit one, what else might be reconstructed from the glow? The question becomes narrower and colder because it leaves the tower and the cable plant behind for a moment. It does not ask how a signal entered the town. It asks what the objects inside the room may have been giving away before anyone noticed. Not pictures of a bed, not a secret camera hidden in the wall. Something more technical, and in some ways more disturbing, the possibility that the image on a screen could leave the screen as radiation, travel through the air, and become readable somewhere else. In 1985, Wim van Eck published a paper in Computers and Security titled Electromagnetic Radiation from Video Display Units, an Eavesdropping Risk. The title is careful. It is a question, not a scream. It does not belong to folklore. It belongs to the language of technical assessment, radiation, display units, eavesdropping, risk. But inside that calm vocabulary is one of the ideas that gives the Your Bedroom file its coldest atmosphere. A display is not only a surface that presents information to the person sitting in front of it. Under the right conditions, it can also be a source of unintended emissions. Van Eck's research described how information shown on video display units could be reconstructed from electromagnetic radiation. That statement needs to be kept exact because it is often where the imagination runs too far. The paper does not mean that every television in a town could simply tune to a house in see-through walls. It does not mean that the fictional channel called Your Bedroom has a literal explanation in which bedrooms were optically captured by leaking screens. It means something narrower, and because it is narrower, it is more useful to this archive. It means that electronic displays, especially in the older environment of cathode ray tubes and video display units, could radiate signals related to what they were showing. Those signals were not meant to be broadcasts. They were not a program feed. They were not a public channel. They were byproducts of operation, escaping from the machinery as the display did its ordinary work. The frightening part is not that the machine was designed to betray the user. The frightening part is that betrayal could be incidental. That distinction matters to the town case. Earlier in the file, the strongest roots for a town-wide television event were centralized ones: a cable headend, a local origination channel, a public, educational, or governmental slot, an emergency alert pathway, a broadcast interruption, or an upstream distribution point. Those mechanisms explain how one picture might become many pictures. Van Eck's paper does not replace them. It deepens the emotional logic underneath them. It explains why, by the mid-1980s, a reasonable technical person could look at a screen and ask whether the private act of viewing or typing was as contained as it seemed. The phrase, your bedroom, works because it collapses two fears into one. The first is distribution, the fear that an unknown operator can force a message into every living room in town. The second is leakage, the fear that the room itself is already participating in an exchange that the resident cannot perceive. Van Eck belongs to the second fear. His paper gives a real name to the suspicion that a display is not a sealed endpoint. It glows, scans, refreshes, and radiates. It is a visible surface attached to invisible activity. The older video display unit was especially suited to this anxiety. Its image was not a static file resting silently behind glass. It was produced by electronic timing, scanning, and repeated renewal. The viewer saw stability. The apparatus performed motion. A screen seemed to hold a word, a form, a line of text, or a picture in place, but the mechanism underneath was constantly rebuilding that image. Van Eck's finding, as preserved in the technical record, was that this process could have electromagnetic consequences beyond the intended display. In a normal office, that risk sounds like a security problem. A person types at a terminal. A document appears on a monitor. Someone nearby, using specialized equipment and knowledge, may attempt to reconstruct what the display is showing by receiving its emissions. That is a serious concern, but it is still contained inside the ordinary language of information security. In the world of your bedroom, the same idea turns domestic. The monitor is no longer only in an office. The television is on a dresser. The computer screen is on a desk near the bed. The home becomes a place where comfort and signal behavior overlap. Again, the archive must be precise. A bedroom channel showing domestic interiors across a town is not established by Van Eck's paper. Electromagnetic eavesdropping on display emissions is not the same as a cable system carrying live views of private rooms. A technical risk around reconstructing displayed information does not equal a universal method for turning televisions into cameras. The horror is not helped by pretending otherwise. It becomes stronger when the boundary is respected, because the boundary tells us what the fear really is. Your bedroom is not frightening only because it might be possible. It is frightening because it resembles several things that were already true in smaller, colder ways. Broadcast systems could be interrupted. Cable systems could centralize distribution. Emergency mechanisms could override ordinary programming. Unlicensed household devices could radiate and receive under rules most residents never read. And display units, according to Van Eck's 1985 research, could leak information through electromagnetic emissions in a form that raised an eavesdropping risk. The fictional channel gathers those truths and gives them a cruel title. There is something almost bureaucratic about the paper's original question. An eavesdropping risk? It is the kind of phrase that belongs in a journal, in a security office, in a conversation between engineers. It does not say, your screen is watching you. It does not say, your room is open. It asks whether the radiation from a video display unit can be used to recover information. But analog horror often begins in exactly that gap between calm, technical phrasing and domestic interpretation. A researcher says emissions. A viewer hears leakage. A researcher says reconstruction. A viewer imagines exposure. That is why the paper sits so naturally in this file, even without proving the central event. The town's witnesses did not need to know the words electromagnetic radiation from video display units. They only needed to feel, afterward, that the machines in their homes had participated in something without consent. The channel name made the private room sound indexed, labeled, and available. Van Eck's research supplies a real historical pressure behind that feeling, the idea that a screen can fail to keep the displayed world entirely to itself. It also changes the meaning of looking. For most viewers, a television is a one-way object. The household faces it. The signal arrives. The screen lights. The family watches. But once leakage enters the imagination, the geometry becomes uncertain. The screen is still a window into programming, but it is also an electrical object in space. It may receive and it may emit. It may be passive in the social sense, yet active in the electromagnetic sense. The viewer's confidence depends on not thinking too long about that difference. The Your Bedroom incident, as a fictional archive, thrives on that loss of confidence. It does not have to show how every room was captured. It only has to create the impression that the domestic boundary was thinner than expected. A wall can stop a neighbor's eyes. A locked door can stop a visitor. A curtain can defeat the street. But none of those familiar protections were designed for invisible emissions, shared infrastructure, override paths, or distribution systems. None of them were built to reassure a person who has begun to suspect that privacy has an electrical dimension. Van Eck's paper belongs to the older computer age, but its anxiety attaches easily to the analog television era. Both worlds were filled with glowing screens that seemed intimate precisely because they were local. The image appeared right there in the room. It felt owned by the viewer. It felt bounded by the plastic case and the glass face. Yet the machinery behind that image belonged to a larger field of signals, timings, wires, and radiation. The screen's intimacy was partly an illusion produced by furniture placement. Put the set on a dresser and it becomes part of the bedroom. Connect it to a cable line, place it near other electronics, let it emit as it operates, and the bedroom is no longer as separate from the outside system as it appears. This is the quietest version of the nightmare. No masked pirate. No sudden alert tone. No satellite message interrupting a movie. Just the suggestion that a private display may have a second life as an unintended transmitter. The image that comforts you may also describe itself to the air. The room may remain physically closed while the evidence of its machines escapes in forms no human sense can register. By the end of the analog period, this fear had become part of a broader historical texture. Snow, scan lines, public access channels, local interruptions, cable headends, emergency overrides, and unintentional emissions all belonged to a media environment that felt physical and shared. Channels seemed like places. Signals seemed like weather. A television could be adjusted, slapped, retuned, or left glowing in the dark, and every strange behavior felt as though it came from somewhere just beyond the wall. That world did not end all at once for every device or every cable system. But in the United States, one date would become the public border for full-power broadcast television, June 12th, 2009. After that, the old analog ghost did not disappear from memory, but it lost one of its native habitats. The fear that screens leak remained. The fear that systems can be interrupted remained. What began to fade was the particular feeling that any channel in any room might drift open like a door. By the time the file reaches June 12th, 2009, the story has already left the screen and entered the walls. The television is no longer only a receiver in the corner. It is the visible end of a chain that may include a cable head end, a local origination source, a public, educational, or governmental channel, an emergency alert path, a satellite feed, a relay, a licensed station, and the small, unlicensed machines inside the house. It is also a surface that people trusted with their unguarded hours. That is why the date matters. On June 12th, 2009, the United States ended full-power analog broadcast television transmission and transitioned those full-power stations to digital-only broadcasting. In policy terms, it was a technical migration. In the language of this file, it was a border marker. Not the end of television risk. Not the end of interruption. Not the end of centralized distribution, local cable control, emergency messaging, unlawful interference, or privacy fear. But the end of one kind of ghost. The ghost belonged to a world in which a channel felt like a physical location. A viewer did not open a menu and select from a library. A viewer tuned. The act itself carried a different imagination of media. Somewhere, a signal was present. Somewhere, a carrier was being received or missed. The picture rolled because synchronization was imperfect. The sound hissed because the path was compromised. Snow did not look like absence in the clean digital sense. It looked like a million fragments of possible reception, a field of tiny accidents waiting for one signal to become stronger than another. The fictional channel called Your Bedroom belongs most naturally to that older feeling. It is harder to imagine it as an app because an app has a border around it. It has a logo, a login, a provider, a transaction history, a chosen stream. But an analog channel, especially in the memory of American households, could feel less contractual. It could feel assigned by geography, cable company, tower, weather, wiring, or the unmarked decisions of a facility the viewer would never see. Earlier in the file, the head end became the town's hidden throat because it gathered incoming feeds and redistributed them. A household could mistake the television for a private object, while the channel lineup depended on a local or regional point of control. Public, educational, and governmental capacity made the disguise even quieter. Under United States law, cable franchising authorities may require channel capacity for those uses. In practice, that meant a municipal bulletin board, a school board meeting, a local access slot, a forgotten community channel. Such channels did not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes they arrived as silence, text, a fixed camera, a calendar, a room with fluorescent light. A channel named Your Bedroom would not need to burst through the wall like a monster. In the analog imagination, it could simply appear where the town already expected local nothingness. June 12th, 2009, did not erase cable systems overnight. It did not erase old cathode ray sets from bedrooms. It did not remove every modulator, every coaxial cable, every low-power device, every internal household source, or every old habit of leaving the television glowing after midnight. The transition specifically marked full-power broadcast stations. That distinction matters because this episode has tried to keep its fear attached to mechanisms rather than mist. A full-power broadcast shutdown is not the same thing as a universal shutdown of analog experience. But public memory is not a technical compliance chart. Public memory chooses dates, and this date became a clean line for a messy ending. Before that line, a strange channel could be understood through the texture of scarcity. There were only so many places to look. A number on the dial or the cable lineup was not infinite. It was an address. If the address changed, if a local channel turned into something else, if the emergency alert system interrupted programming, if a broadcast relay or upstream feed was compromised, the event could feel communal in a way that modern individualized viewing often does not. People in different houses could turn to the same place and see the same wrong thing at the same time. That shared wrongness is the core of the case. The horror is not only that a private room appears, it is that it appears through a system designed for everyone. Privacy is violated in the language of public service. The bedroom becomes programming. The most intimate space in the house takes on the bureaucratic form of a channel label. The DTV transition changed the cultural texture around that fear. Digital television can fail, and it can be manipulated, and digital systems have their own vulnerabilities. But they fail differently in the domestic imagination. Analog failure drifted. Digital failure often stops, blocks, freezes, or refuses. Analog invited pareidolia. A face might seem to gather in static. A voice might almost be present under hiss. A weak signal might smear into another. The viewer had room to believe that reception was a negotiation with distance. That is the kind of world where a person could sit at the foot of a bed and think, not entirely irrationally, that the television had found something it was not supposed to find. The older broadcast incidents in this file take on a different weight when placed before June 12th, 2009. On November 22, 1987, in Chicago, unauthorized video interrupted WGN-TV Channel 9 and WTTW Channel 11. The second interruption, identified in WTTW's retrospective as occurring during Doctor Who, replaced an ordinary broadcast with a figure resembling Max Headroom. A UPI report published the next day described a video pirate striking 2 stations. The perpetrators were not publicly identified. That unresolved quality keeps the event alive in the archive. On April 27, 1986, the Captain Midnight incident showed another route, an unauthorized message interrupting HBO's satellite-distributed signal during a film broadcast. That case had a known operator, John R. McDougall, and it carried the threat upstream towards satellite distribution and the possibility that one point in the chain could affect many viewers below it. Those incidents do not prove your bedroom, now named, or anything the type is commonish. They do something more useful for this kind of report. They mark the edges of plausibility. They show that ordinary viewing could be displaced. They show that a signal path could be wounded above the household. They show that viewers did not have to seek out the impossible. Sometimes the impossible arrived in the middle of the scheduled program. June 12, 2009 is therefore not presented here as a rescue. It is not the day the door closed. It is the day the old doorframe began to be removed from public life. The fictional town in this file is most frightening when imagined before or around that border, when full-power analog broadcasting still shaped the way people thought about television, and when cable lineups, local access channels, emergency interruptions, and household radio frequency devices all belonged to the same ordinary mental map. A viewer did not need to know the exact path from tower to headend to wall plate. The body knew enough. If the screen changed, something outside had reached inside. And after the transition, that bodily knowledge did not simply vanish. It stayed in older sets. It stayed in family rooms and motel rooms and school audiovisual closets. It stayed in the memory of Channel Snow. It stayed in the habit of trusting an alert tone. It stayed in the discomfort of learning. Through research like Wim Van Eyck's 1985 paper in Computers and Security, that screens and electronics could leak information in ways the ordinary user could not perceive. The old analog ghost lost one habitat, but the larger fear survived by changing shape. That is why the archive cannot close the case on June 12, 2009. The date helps us identify the atmosphere of the nightmare. It tells us what kind of media world could make your bedroom feel native rather than decorative. It separates the horror of a drifting channel from the horror of a compromised account, a hacked camera, or a malicious stream. It reminds us that this story is not about all technologies at once. It is about a particular arrangement of trust, shared channels, centralized distribution, official interruptions, obscure facilities, household receivers, and rooms people believed were outside the network. By the end of that era, the question was no longer whether analog television could produce unease. The record had already shown enough. Chicago, HBO, emergency paths, headends, local channels, unlicensed devices, leaking displays. Each fact remained limited. Each mechanism had boundaries. But together, they formed the corridor through which the fictional incident walks. The remaining problem is the first point of corruption. If every television in town displayed the same impossible label, something had to become common before it became personal. A feed, a channel slot, an override, a relay, a satellite path, a local origination source, or perhaps only the belief, older than the transition itself, that the bedroom had ever been separate from the system carrying pictures through the wall. By the time the file reaches its last folder, the question has become smaller than the town and larger than any one machine. It is not whether the channel called your bedroom can be solved by naming one switch, one tower, one technician, or one criminal. The evidence we have used does not allow that kind of ending. The stronger conclusion is quieter. For the broadcast to feel personal, something first had to be shared. That is why the first door matters. If the corrupted point was the cable head end, the event begins as a problem of centralization. A head end is not mysterious in its proper role. It is a practical facility, a place where feeds can be received, processed, modulated, and redistributed across a cable system. Satellite programming, off-air broadcasts, local origination material, public access channels, and other sources may all pass through this kind of point before arriving as ordinary choices on a subscriber's set. In that version, your bedroom is frightening because the town's living rooms were never as separate as they seemed. They were downstream of the same throat. One wrong input, one misrouted source, one unauthorized insertion at the point of aggregation, and the private act of watching becomes a municipal experience. But that explanation has limits. A head end can make one signal common. It cannot, by itself, explain the accusation inside the title. It can explain why every television sees the same thing. It does not explain why the thing on the screen appears to know where it is being watched. That gap is where the horror enters, and where an honest archive report must refuse to pretend that a mechanism proves more than it can prove. If the first door was a local origination channel, the story changes shape. Local origination and public, educational, or governmental capacity give the impossible channel a believable costume. United States law, under 47 U.S.C. Section 531, allows cable franchising authorities to require channel capacity for public, educational, or governmental use. PEG channels can carry civic meetings, school information, bulletin boards, local notices, and programming that many viewers pass without attention. A channel called Your Bedroom could hide, at first, inside that dullness. It would not need to crash in with the drama of a national intrusion. It could sit where the town already expected static schedules, empty feeds, community announcements, and low production images. That is the perfect disguise because it is not spectacular. It is bureaucratic. The local channel is one of the few places on a television lineup where a strange title might appear before anyone asks whether it belongs there. The terror comes from the delay. For a few seconds, the viewer may not think, this is an attack. The viewer may think, this is one of ours. If the first door was the emergency path, the problem is not disguise, but authority. The emergency alert system exists for public warning. FEMA describes it as a national public warning system that can interrupt radio and television programming, including broadcast, cable, satellite, and wireline video services. Its participants include radio and television broadcasters, cable television, wireless cable systems, satellite operators, and wireline operators. Its power, in ordinary use, comes from trust. The alert is allowed to outrank the program. The interruption is not a failure of television. It is one of television's civic duties. In the nightmare version, that trust becomes the vulnerable surface. The viewer has been trained not to change the channel when the alert takes over. The tones, the crawl, the forced break, the official cadence, all of these tell the body to wait and listen. FEMA also describes emergency alert system monitoring as a daisy chain system in which station equipment monitors other stations for alerts, independent of the internet. That design matters because it imagines warning as a chain of trust, moving from participant to participant. It is not proof of the fictional channel. It is a reason the fictional channel feels so difficult to dismiss. If a false message ever wore the clothing of public warning, viewers might obey it before they understood it. If the first door was a relay, the event belongs to the older broadcast landscape of links, towers, antennas, and line-of-sight paths. This is where Chicago remains the archival shadow. On November 22, 1987, unauthorized video interrupted WGN-TV, Channel 9, and WTTW, Channel 11. A UPI report published the next day described a video pirate striking two television stations and replacing regular programming with skits featuring a figure resembling Max Headroom. WTTW's own retrospective identifies the second interruption as occurring during Doctor Who. The perpetrators were not publicly identified. That case does not give us Your Bedroom. It gives us a public memory of replacement. People were watching normal television in ordinary rooms when an unauthorized signal appeared where the familiar program had been. The exact technical path should be handled cautiously. Later accounts associate Chicago transmission infrastructure, including the John Hancock Center, with the broader narrative, but the point for this file is not to overstate what the public record can bear. The point is that a broadcast system could be interrupted in a way that left witnesses, investigations, and no publicly named culprit. A solved intrusion becomes history. An unresolved intrusion keeps breathing. If the first door was upstream, the town is no longer the true scene of the event. The Captain Midnight incident on April 27, 1986, demonstrated that unauthorized interference could reach a satellite-distributed signal. Historical accounts associate the incident with HBO and the satellite Galaxy 1, and John R. MacDougall was identified in contemporary reporting and the legal aftermath. That case matters because it expands the map. The signal can be injured before it ever becomes local. Downstream viewers may experience the interruption at home, but the wound may have occurred far above them at a point they cannot see and cannot repair. For Your Bedroom, this possibility is especially unsettling. It means the town might not have been chosen in the way the witnesses imagined. The town might have been only the place where an upstream failure became visible. Or it might have been one of many places, with the archive preserving only the community that noticed, recorded, and remembered. Satellite distribution turns the local haunting into a distribution problem. The bedroom is still intimate. The root is not. If the first door was unlawful interference, then the file enters the language of prohibition. Federal law under 47 U.S.C. Section 333 prohibits willful or malicious interference with radio communications of stations licensed or authorized under United States Communications Law. FCC Part 15 rules, including 47 CFR Section 15.5, require unlicensed radio frequency devices to operate on the condition that they do not cause harmful interference and that they accept interference from authorized stations and other radiators. These rules do not make the story simple. They make the environment real. Homes, transmitters, receivers, modulators, consumer electronics, and authorized services all occupy a crowded electromagnetic world governed by power, distance, design, and regulation. The domestic version of the fear is more delicate. It is not enough to say that a television was hacked. The title, Your Bedroom, suggests exposure, not merely interruption. That is where the earlier privacy anxiety returns. Wim van Eyck's 1985 paper in Computers and Security, titled Electromagnetic Radiation from Video Display Units and Eavesdropping Risk, described research showing that information displayed on video display units could be reconstructed from electromagnetic emissions. This does not mean a town-wide channel could literally see through walls. It does not turn every screen into a camera, but it gives a documented technical basis to a period fear that devices inside the room might reveal more than their owners understood. So the final comparison does not produce a single culprit. It produces a set of doors. The headend explains how one altered feed could become common. Local origination and peg capacity explain how the channel could look ordinary long enough to be accepted. The emergency alert system explains why an interruption might carry authority before it carried meaning. The daisy chain model explains how trust can move from one participant to another. Broadcast relay vulnerability explains the shock of replacement. Satellite distribution explains how the wound might be upstream from the town. Unlawful interference explains why the act belongs not only to folklore, but to a regulated communications world where malicious disruption is a recognized danger. Domestic electromagnetic privacy fears explain why the word bedroom changes the event from a technical failure into a violation. Each mechanism answers part of the question. None answers all of it. That is the proper shape of this archive. The fictional incident should not be falsely solved, because a clean solution would make it smaller. The town did not need to imagine the event for the fear to be real. It needed only to live inside systems where private viewing depended on public infrastructure, where warning paths could interrupt entertainment, where local channels could appear without ceremony, where satellites and relays could carry distant decisions into nearby rooms, and where household electronics already made people wonder what escaped the screen. Your bedroom is terrifying because it fuses two kinds of shame. The first is public shame, the fear of being seen by the town, named by a channel, placed in a common lineup. The second is technical shame, the realization that the ordinary home was never completely outside the network. The cable entered through the wall. The antenna listened from the roof. The alert system claimed priority over the program. The local channel sat waiting in the guide. The screen glowed, received, radiated, and obeyed. The unresolved question, then, is not whether the town imagined it. The unresolved question is, which door opened first? Was it the channel slot, made available by a local system that treated empty capacity as harmless? Was it the warning path, trusted because public safety depends on trust? Was it an upstream feed, corrupted before the town ever had a chance to refuse it? Was it a relay, a headend, a satellite path, an unlawful transmission, a device too small to notice until the picture changed? Or was the first door older than all of those mechanisms? The idea that a bedroom was separate from the wires, signals, policies, and machines that carried the outside world into it every night. The archive cannot close that door for us. It can only show where the hinges were,